Would you even notice if it happened quietly? If someone, somewhere, began telling a story in which you were the obstacle, not the villain in a cartoonish sense, not evil, not cruel, just the one who stood in the way of someone else's survival, their progress, their escape. What if you were the stranger who parked too long in front of an alley where someone planned to hide? What if you were the coworker who took the last shift the day someone needed a lifeline? What if your success, your comfort, your simple routine made it just a little harder for someone else to breathe? You'd never know. That's the part that stays with you. It's easy to imagine ourselves as bystanders in other people's stories, sometimes even as heroes. But what if you're not the extra in the background, and you're not the savior either? What if you're the tension in the plot, the reason they cry harder or lose hope faster? What if their suffering sharpens every time you win? You don't have to be malicious to do damage. Sometimes just moving forward means stepping over someone else. Not because you're cruel, but because you didn't stop to look down. Maybe you got the job they needed. Maybe your silence made their pain easier to ignore. Maybe you chose convenience, and your convenience crushed them slowly. You didn't hear them cry out, but maybe they cried anyway. Maybe they still do. And maybe they've built a story around that pain, one where they survive, escape, rise. And in that story, you are the one they had to endure, the shadow they had to crawl out from under, the reason they felt like giving up, but didn't. You imagine yourself as kind, decent, thoughtful, but that's not how stories work. People don't remember what you meant to do. They remember what you did, or what you didn't. You might think none of this is fair, that it's unreasonable for someone to make you into a villain when you were just living your life. You were tired, you were trying, you were doing your best. But fairness doesn't matter in survival stories. All that matters is who got hurt and who didn't. You think about the people you've forgotten, the ones who drifted out of your life quietly, without confrontation. What if they didn't just move on? What if they're still carrying you with them, years later, as a wound that won't close? What if your apology never came? Not because you didn't care, but because you never realized they were bleeding. Some stories don't need a villain to be painful, but sometimes the pain needs a face, and if yours fits, even by accident, even just once, then that's who you become in their memory. Not because you are evil, but because you were there and you didn't help. You can say it wasn't your fault. You didn't know. You were doing what anyone would do. But that doesn't erase the harm. It just makes it quieter, more invisible, harder to answer for. And what if that's the most unsettling part? That you might be the villain in someone's story and never find out. That they might have needed you at your best, and you gave them your indifference. That they might have spent years recovering from something you don't even remember doing. You wonder how many survival stories are unfolding right now, across the street, at your job, in your past, and how many of them whisper your name, in anger or sorrow or silence. And you realize that being the villain isn't about power or cruelty, it's about absence, about apathy. About choosing ease over empathy, over and over again, until someone breaks beneath the weight of your comfort. Because you don't have to hate someone to ruin them. You just have to matter more to yourself than they ever could. And in their story, the one they tell themselves so they can keep going, they will remember you, not for who you are, but for what you didn't do, when it mattered most. Would you tell a child a lie if it meant they would grow up to be good? Not happier, not smarter, just good, morally sound, compassionate, selfless. The kind of person who would step in when others wouldn't. The kind who carries other people's pain as if it were their own. but only if they never learn the truth. The lie would be small, but deep. A belief you implant early when they're still too young to question it. Something about the world, or themselves, or what happens when we die. Something unprovable, but powerful. Something that makes them kind. Would you say it? Knowing it's false, you might say no at first. Insist that truth matters, that it's wrong to manipulate a child's mind, even with good intentions, that people deserve to live in reality, no matter how painful. But what if the truth makes them cruel? What if they grow up in a world stripped bare, where nothing means anything, where every good deed feels pointless? What if the truth teaches them indifference, or resentment, or despair? Would you still protect their right to know it? You've seen how belief shapes people, how some children raised with certain ideas grow into gentle, decent adults, not because the ideas were true, but because they made goodness feel necessary. And you've seen others fall into bitterness, cynicism, cruelty, not because they were evil, but because the truth felt cold and empty, and no one gave them a reason to care. What if the difference between the two was just a single idea whispered into their ear, once early enough to take root? Would you whisper it? Maybe you're imagining a religious belief, or a story about justice, or something about love always prevailing. But it doesn't have to be that. It could be anything. Anything that creates the illusion of meaning. Anything that makes them feel watched or needed or responsible for others. It doesn't have to be beautiful. It just has to work. But that's where the discomfort begins, isn't it? Because now you're not just shaping a child, you're designing them, crafting a version of them that you prefer, not for their sake, but for yours, for the world's. And what if they find out? What if, at 27 or 43, they stumble across something that unravels it all? The book they weren't supposed to read, the conversation they weren't supposed to hear. What happens to the goodness then? Does it collapse with the lie? Do they become something else? Angry, betrayed, hollow, or worse? Do they keep being good, even after knowing it was all a lie? Would that be noble or horrifying? Would you want someone's goodness to persist out of pure will, or would you rather they always believed in a story that made it feel natural? And now ask yourself this: why do you think you're different? What do you believe that someone planted in you long ago? What story still shapes your actions, even if it's no longer true? Maybe it was something a teacher said, or something you heard in a movie when you were 10. Maybe it's something your parents told you, not because it was accurate, but because they were afraid of who you might become without it. Would you want to know which of your beliefs were lies? And if you did, would you stop being good? The lie doesn't have to be grand. It could be as small as a sentence. There's always a reason to be kind. Someone is always watching. Everything happens for a reason. Just a few words repeated, often enough to become invisible, to become a lens through which every choice passes. And maybe you've already done it. Maybe you've told a child something comforting, knowing it wasn't quite true, but needing it to be true for them, for their safety, for your peace of mind. Maybe you've already decided that some lies are worth it, so long as they make people good. So why hesitate now? Why feel unease at the idea of designing a child's mind for moral effect? Is it the manipulation, or is it the fear of what it reveals about your own beliefs? That you don't really want truth, that you want goodness more? And if that's the case, if you're willing to deceive a child to make them good, what else would you do? What other lies would you justify? What other minds would you shape? At what point does shaping turn into control? And how much of what you call morality is just the result of someone else's lie? Maybe that's the most uncomfortable thought of all. Not that you'd lie to a child to make them good, but that someone already did that to you, and it worked. Imagine realizing that what you believe isn't real, not because someone lied to you, but because your brain quietly decided it didn't want to know the truth. You think you're someone who values honesty, someone who wants to see the world as it really is. But there's something underneath that. Something quieter, something stronger. A reflex you didn't choose. Your mind reaches for comfort. Automatically, instinctively. And it does it so well, you don't even notice. It starts small. You tell yourself someone cares about you more than they actually do. You pretend your job has meaning, even when it feels hollow. You frame your failures as lessons, just to avoid admitting you feel like you're falling behind. None of these thoughts are exactly false, but they're not exactly true either. They're close enough to truth to feel safe and far enough from truth to feel good. Your brain is built for this. It's not trying to deceive you, it's trying to protect you. From pain, from chaos, from the possibility that none of this means what you think it does. Your mind edits your perception before you even get a chance to see it unfiltered. And what's left is a version of reality that's more tolerable, more manageable, slightly softer at the edges. You notice this most when truth threatens something important. If a belief you've held for years starts to unravel, you don't feel curiosity, you feel dread. If someone tells you a hard truth about who you are, your first instinct isn't gratitude, it's defense. You explain, justify, rationalize. Not to convince them, but to convince yourself that your image of reality can remain intact. Even when the evidence is overwhelming, your mind finds ways to avoid it. It shifts the goalposts, blames the source, questions the data, reinterprets the meaning. Anything to avoid the collapse of a comfortable narrative. Because facing the truth often means facing loss, loss of certainty, loss of control, loss of identity. And that loss feels like death, not literal, physical death, but the death of who you thought you were. The death of a version of your life you believed was stable, coherent, meaningful. That's what your brain is trying to save you from. It isn't just clinging to comfort, it's clinging to survival. This is why some people stay in relationships that hurt them, why they believe in systems that exploit them, why they defend ideologies that make them feel safe, even when they're built on lies. It isn't stupidity, it isn't ignorance, it's fear. The kind of fear that lives deep beneath thought. The kind that feels like falling into a void. So the brain builds scaffolding. Stories, explanations, illusions. Not to manipulate, but to stabilize. You aren't being tricked, you're being kept afloat. And you do it too. You convince yourself you're a good person, even when you hurt someone. You tell yourself you're fine, even when you're unraveling. You pretend you have time, even when the clock is running down, because the alternative is unbearable. To really look, to really see, to admit the parts of yourself that are small, scared, selfish, or broken. There's a reason we call them uncomfortable truths. Not just because they hurt, but because they threaten to undo the structures that hold us together. And when that happens, your brain intervenes. It whispers what you want to hear. It tells you you're okay, that things make sense, that everything will be fine. But what if they won't be? What if the truth is that your life is more fragile, more chaotic, more uncertain than you want to admit? What if you're not who you think you are? What if the person you've become is built on layers of denial, distraction, and quiet self-deception? You tell yourself you want truth, but how many times have you looked away from it? How many times have you chosen the easier version of a hard situation, the simpler explanation, the comforting lie? Not because you're weak, but because you're human. And this is what being human means. You survive by filtering. You endure by forgetting. You cope by not knowing. And every time you avoid a difficult truth, your brain rewards you. It gives you peace, relief, a sense of safety. It feels like clarity, but it's sedation, like falling asleep with your eyes open. The most painful part is realizing that most of your life might be shaped by these choices. Not dramatic ones, just quiet, repeated preferences for ease over honesty, for stability over confrontation, for illusion over awareness. You think you're searching for truth, but most of the time you're searching for a version of the truth you can live with. And even now, you might be doing it. As you listen, as you reflect, you might already be softening what this means, reframing it as a curiosity, a philosophical puzzle, something interesting but not personal. But it is personal. It always was. Because the part of you that says, I want to know, is always at war with the part that says, please don't tell me. And most of the time, the second voice wins. Quietly, effortlessly, completely. Would you feel the same pain if you caused it on purpose? Think carefully, not just about pain in general, but about the kind you deliver, knowingly, deliberately, by your own choice. When you hurt someone accidentally, there's guilt, regret, even shame. But when you do it on purpose, something shifts, not necessarily in the pain they feel, but in how real it feels to you. Somehow, it feels smaller, less sharp, like the pain doesn't fully count. Maybe it's because you braced for it. You knew it was coming. And when the consequence finally arrived, it felt earned, controlled, even justified. It was pain on your terms. You delivered it. So you decide what it means. You control the narrative, the weight, the memory. And that control dulls the edge. It makes something that should be unbearable feel manageable, remote, almost clean. This doesn't just happen in moments of cruelty. It happens in tiny choices. Every day, a lie you tell that you know will hurt someone, but you tell it anyway because the alternative seems worse. The harsh truth you deliver under the guise of honesty, the silence you offer instead of comfort, because you've convinced yourself they deserve to feel alone. In those moments, the pain you cause doesn't feel real. Not in the way it would if someone did it to you. Because you're not watching pain. You're assigning it, shaping it, giving it a reason. And when pain has a reason, it becomes easier to ignore. You think of yourself as fair, as reasonable, as someone who only causes pain when it's necessary. But necessary is a moving target. It shifts depending on how much you want to believe you're still good. You redefine words, reframe intentions, reroute blame, until harm becomes logic, cruelty becomes clarity, and pain becomes someone else's problem. But what if they don't see it that way? What if their experience of that pain has no shape, no logic, no narrative that makes it smaller? What if, to them, it's just suffering, plain and raw, delivered without warning by someone they trusted? Do you see it then? Do you feel it? Or does it still feel less real, simply because you meant it? This is the quiet privilege of the one who causes pain, the privilege of distance. You don't have to feel what they feel. You only have to feel your version of it. And your version is always filtered, justified, softened, manageable. You tell yourself you are honest. You tell yourself they needed to hear it. You tell yourself they were too sensitive, or too stubborn, or too fragile. And every justification makes the pain a little less real in your mind. But what if you're wrong? What if pain isn't diminished by purpose? What if intention doesn't shrink it? It only makes it harder to see. What if the most dangerous harm is the kind you feel morally entitled to deliver. Because that's the kind you never examine, never doubt, never take back. You think about the people you've hurt on purpose, the arguments you escalated, the apologies you withheld, the moments when you knew your words would land like knives and you said them anyway. You convinced yourself they deserved it, that it was part of some greater lesson, some larger truth. But now in the quiet afterward, you wonder, were you teaching a lesson or just trying to win? Because the truth is, pain never disappears. It doesn't shrink because it made sense to you. It doesn't soften because it served a purpose. And it doesn't vanish because it happened behind your justifications. It stays. It lives inside the people you gave it to. And maybe you'll never see it. Maybe they'll never tell you. But it's there, waiting. Growing in the space where connection used to live. And maybe you're doing the same thing to yourself. Maybe the pain you cause isn't just harming others, it's also distancing you from your own ability to feel, to care, to connect. Because every time you decide a pain was deserved, a part of you gets quieter, harder, less able to trust your own empathy, less willing to let someone else's suffering feel real. Eventually, the only pain that feels real is your own. You'll cry when someone hurts you. You'll rage when someone lets you down. You'll spiral when you feel abandoned or misunderstood. And still, somehow, you won't make the connection. That what you feel is what others once felt because of you. That the pain you now live with is the same kind you once dismissed. That the only difference is who caused it and who had to carry it afterward. But by then, the distance will be too great. You'll barely remember the words you said or the moments you pushed too hard. You'll remember the logic, the justification, the control, and the pain you caused will feel like a footnote, just part of what had to happen. Until one day someone does it to you, and they'll mean it, they'll have reasons, they'll explain it calmly, they'll call it honesty, or growth, or truth. And you'll feel it anyway, as sharp, as unbearable, as real. The gun is already pointed at you. The rules were never explained. There was no warning, just a silent countdown you didn't know had started. And now you're here, caught in the space between knowing and acting, between recognizing a threat and doing something about it. That's where hesitation lives, and it's already too late. You tell yourself there's still time, that you're just thinking carefully, that the pause is necessary, even wise. But this isn't reflection. It's paralysis. And in that brief suspension, when your hand doesn't move, your voice doesn't speak, your body doesn't respond, everything has already shifted. The outcome has already turned against you. Because the moment you hesitate, you lose control. Not because you're weak or wrong or bad at deciding, but because the world doesn't wait. The threat doesn't wait. The moment doesn't freeze just because you're not ready. You might still make a choice, but it won't be yours anymore. It'll be a reaction, shaped by fear, not resolve. Most people think of hesitation as harmless, a moment to weigh your options. But what it really is a fracture. The breaking point where instinct and thought collide and neither wins. It's not choosing badly, it's failing to choose at all. And in many moments, that failure is the only thing that matters. You might imagine yourself in a high-stakes moment, a crisis, a confrontation, a moral test. But this isn't about dramatic turning points, it's about small decisions, micro moments. The subtle, almost invisible times when you feel a pull to act and decide to wait instead. Not because you've concluded the risk is too high, but because you're afraid. Because deep down you want someone else to go first. To make it safe. To make it obvious. But life never gives you that luxury. Hesitation feels like caution. But often, it's just fear in disguise. A disguised refusal to take responsibility for the consequences of acting too soon or acting at all. You tell yourself you're being thoughtful, but thought without action becomes self-deception. A loop you replay endlessly until the moment has passed and the door has closed. And then you pretend it wasn't yours to walk through anyway. Even in moments of moral decision, hesitation reshapes everything. You might believe you're a good person, someone who would act when it counts. But when the moment arrives, the stakes are unclear. The consequences are uncertain. And so you pause. You let doubt creep in. You tell yourself you're waiting for clarity, for certainty. But morality rarely offers either. So the delay becomes the decision. Imagine standing before a person in danger, someone screaming for help, and for just a second you look around to see if anyone else is going to step in. That's all it takes. One glance, one breath, and already the story is changing. Not because you didn't care, but because care without courage is silence. Now, look closer at what hesitation really costs. It doesn't just let danger move first, it redefines you. Because once you hesitate, the self-image you carried begins to erode. The certainty that you would act, that you're the kind of person who steps forward, begins to decay. You become the person who thought, who paused, who watched. And even if you act later, that version of you, the decisive one, is already gone. What's left is someone trying to compensate, to reclaim something they already surrendered. And the worst part is that you usually don't notice when it happens. You tell yourself the opportunity never really existed, that the window wasn't open, that the chance was too small, too risky, too uncertain. But that's the lie you tell to protect your identity, to preserve the illusion that hesitation was a strategy, not a retreat. And that's when it becomes unbearable, because then you realize the damage wasn't external, it was internal. It wasn't that someone else beat you or that the world moved too fast. It was that you failed to meet yourself at the moment that mattered. You blinked, you flinched, you waited, and no one saw it happen, but you did. The truth is, we build ourselves in tiny moments, not through grand declarations or carefully crafted values, but through instinctual responses to the unexpected. And if those moments are ruled by fear or doubt or the desire to avoid being wrong, then hesitation doesn't just change the outcome, it changes you. The people who seem fearless aren't without fear. They've just stopped negotiating with it. They don't pause to confirm that their feelings are valid or that the risks are fair. They move, even when the ground isn't solid. They act before the full picture is clear. Not because they know they're right, but because they know hesitation is worse. You can lose a fight and recover. You can make the wrong choice and learn. But once you hesitate, the version of you that could have acted dies in that instant. And whatever you do next is no longer coming from strength. It's coming from the shadow of delay. There's a reason hesitation feels quiet, even invisible. Because it doesn't scream. It doesn't announce itself. It just steals time, 1 second at a time, until nothing is left to choose from. And by the time you realize that, you're already too late. Imagine the thing you fear most. Whatever it is, not the fear itself, but the form it takes, the face, the voice, the feeling it creates in your body. Maybe it's cruelty, maybe it's control, maybe it's becoming invisible, or powerless, or hated. Now imagine this. What if the only way forward was to become it, not to confront it, not to resist it, but to let it in, to adopt it, to reshape yourself around it, piece by piece, until the difference between you and the thing you hate becomes hard to see. You try to back away from the thought. You tell yourself there must be another option. There has to be. That's what you've always believed. That if you just hold on long enough, fight hard enough, stay good enough, you'll find a way out without changing who you are. But time keeps passing, and the pressure doesn't stop. The pain doesn't ease. The choice stays in front of you, silent, patient, waiting. You start to notice something. The people who survived what you're facing, they changed, they hardened, they made decisions you swore you never would. They crossed lines, broke rules, gave things up, and they're still here, still breathing. You wonder what they lost, and more importantly, what they gained. Because what if survival demands transformation? Not the kind you control, but the kind that rewrites you, whether you agree to it or not. You tell yourself you're different. You'll find a way to stay intact. But then you feel it, the shift. The moment you realize that to be safe, you have to intimidate. To be respected, you have to stop apologizing. To protect someone, you have to be willing to threaten, manipulate, maybe even destroy. And the worst part is how quickly it starts to make sense. What you feared begins to feel like armor, like freedom, like strength. You don't want to admit it, but there's relief in it. In giving up the constant vulnerability. In letting go of the need to be good, to be kind, to be soft. You tell yourself it's temporary. You'll become what you fear just long enough to get through this. Then you'll undo it. Clean it off. Go back. But you already know it doesn't work that way. Because every time you cross the line, the next one gets easier to cross. What once felt impossible starts to feel inevitable, natural, necessary. And maybe the real trap wasn't becoming what you fear, it was thinking you never would. You were so certain of who you were, so confident that fear was something outside of you, something to run from, fight against. But now you see that fear wasn't chasing you. It was showing you something. Something you didn't want to know, that inside you, buried deep, is a version of yourself you swore you'd never become. And the question now is no longer about choice. It's about recognition. Because maybe you were always capable of this. Maybe the lines you thought defined you were never solid. Maybe becoming what you fear isn't a transformation at all. Maybe it's just remembering who you've always been. Imagine someone offers you two paths, one that feels right and one that might be better, but the better one is invisible. You'll never see it, never know what it could have become. All you have is this moment, this choice, and the quiet certainty that by choosing anything, you've erased everything else. That's the trap. Every time you decide, you kill something. Not dramatically, not violently, but absolutely. You eliminate futures. You narrow down the infinity of what could have been into the single thread of what is. And you do it constantly. When you take a job, when you fall in love, when you say yes, when you say no, each choice feels like gain, but it's always built on loss, a hidden sacrifice, an unknown cost. You might not feel it. You're told to be decisive, to move forward, to not dwell on what might have been, but the feeling slips in anyway, in hesitation, in quiet moments. In the way your mind sometimes drifts to lives you'll never live, people you'll never meet, versions of yourself that will never exist. And here's the hardest part. You'll never know if those paths were better. That's what makes it haunting. You can't measure what you've lost. You can't grieve for it properly because it never got to become real. It's just a silence behind every door you close. We want to believe we're choosing the best option, that we're optimizing, that we're rational, but we don't get to compare. We get one life, one thread, and every step forward burns all the others behind us. The more certain we are, the less we notice the fire. You might think it's fine, that this is just how life works. But what if the best version of you is the one you already erased? What if the choice you made 5 years ago wasn't just a mistake, it was a permanent deletion of the person you were most meant to be? You'll never know. That's what makes it unbearable. Sometimes you look at your life and feel grateful. Sometimes you feel trapped, and you can't always tell the difference. You tell yourself it worked out, that this is where you're meant to be. But deep down, you wonder if that's just a defense mechanism, a way to keep the noise out, a way to stop imagining what might have happened if you'd said something different, left a little earlier, stayed a little longer, and the illusion grows stronger with time. The more you commit to one path, the more painful it becomes to imagine the others. So you stop. You tell yourself there was never another way, that this was inevitable, that you didn't really have a choice. But you did, and you still do. Right now, even now, you are choosing. Every minute you stay where you are. You're choosing not to move. Every time you say, "I'm not ready," you're choosing not to become something else. And every one of those choices is a quiet execution of something unknowable. That's the part no one tells you, that the scariest decisions aren't between good and bad. They're between good and unknown, between a life you can see and a life you'll never be allowed to know. And so you keep walking, confident on the surface, uncertain underneath, wondering sometimes in flashes, sometimes in long silences, if this version of you is the one that was supposed to make it, or if the best version of you was buried somewhere in the past, lost in a choice that felt harmless at the time. Maybe you made the right decision, maybe you didn't, but the worst part is, you'll never know. And that question, quiet, unanswered, permanent, is the one that follows you everywhere. Would you torture a child if it meant ending war forever? Not metaphorically, not as a thought experiment. You're in a room, a real child, and it's not ambiguous. This is the only way. No tricks, no alternatives. Every second you hesitate, the world keeps suffering. The only thing between peace and another year of war is your hand, your will, your willingness to become someone else. You say no, you'd never. But the thought lingers longer than it should, because you wonder, what if no one else will? What if everyone else says no too? Does that make you a protector or a coward? You want to believe that good people stay good, no matter the circumstance. That goodness is something fixed, something intrinsic. But people change, slowly, invisibly, under pressure. Not just from desperation, but from clarity. Because sometimes the wrong thing starts to look like the only thing. Imagine you've watched your family die. Imagine you've lost everything, over and over, and then someone offers you a button. One life for millions. Wouldn't your fingers twitch? Wouldn't you tell yourself it's not murder, it's justice? This is how it begins. Not with rage, but with reason. Not with hatred, but with logic. The thought that what you're doing isn't evil. It's necessary. It's protective. It's even compassionate, in a warped way. You convince yourself that the greater good matters more than the self. You tell yourself that saints must sometimes suffer for what's right, and then you start deciding who else should. It doesn't feel like becoming a monster. It feels like stepping up, taking responsibility. Everyone else hesitates, argues, debates, while you act. You do the hard thing. You bear the weight. No one else will. You call it bravery, but maybe it's just the beginning of forgetting what decency feels like. Because once you've crossed that line, even once, everything changes. What used to feel unthinkable now feels plausible, then practical, then routine. You stop asking, "Is this wrong?" and start asking, Does this work? The morality doesn't disappear. It just becomes background noise. A faint echo you learn to ignore. And the more good you think you're doing, the easier it is to keep going. You become the exception. The one who can handle it. The one who knows better. You start believing that your choices are beyond judgment, that your intent purifies your actions. But intent doesn't erase impact. It just hides it under justification. Now imagine someone tries to stop you. Someone who still believes in lines that shouldn't be crossed. You look at them and see weakness. Analysis. You don't hate them, but you pity them. They don't understand what it takes. They don't see the full picture. And maybe, without even realizing it, you begin to see them as obstacles. This is the final step, when kindness starts to look like betrayal, when mercy looks like sabotage, when saving others requires silencing those who disagree. You don't enjoy it, but you tell yourself it's the cost of leadership, the price of doing what must be done. You tell yourself it's still for the greater good, even as the good becomes harder to define. And now look at yourself, not as you were before, but as you are now. How many lines have you crossed? How many rationalizations have you whispered in the dark? How many times have you called yourself righteous while doing things you once found repulsive? You wonder if there's still a difference between you and the people you once condemned. You used to believe that morality was about who you are, but now you see it's more about where you are, what moment you're standing in, what pressure you're under, what story you tell yourself about, why the rules no longer apply. Because in the right context, even saints become monsters, and monsters always believe they're doing the right thing. Would you do it? Would you press a button that ends the world if it meant saving the person you love most? Not a metaphor, not a fantasy. One button, one life saved, and everything else gone. Everyone, everything, every breath, every home, every child, every moment of laughter, fear, hope, erased for one person. The question feels unreal at first, like something you'd never actually face. But imagine it carefully. Picture their face, the one you love, the one whose absence you can't even think about without your chest tightening. They're in front of you, broken, fading, seconds from being gone forever. And beside them, the button. No delay, no warning. No one will know. No one will stop you. Would you do it? Maybe you think you wouldn't. Maybe you think no one's life is worth more than the world. But how sure are you, really? What happens when love stops being abstract, when it stops being a feeling and becomes a desperate animal panic in your blood? What happens when the pain isn't just emotional, but physical? When watching them suffer is like being torn apart from the inside? You tell yourself you care about humanity, about principles, about the future. But in that moment, all of humanity becomes a distant blur. All your morals become background noise. You feel only the presence of one person, and the unbearable weight of their absence, just seconds away. And maybe you tell yourself love is about sacrifice. That real love would let them go. That you'd let them die rather than become a murderer 1,000,000,000 times over. But is that true, or is that just the version of love you can stomach when it's safe? Because real love, the kind that grips your bones, doesn't always look noble. Sometimes it looks like desperation, like madness, like violence. You might believe you could walk away, but what if you hesitated just a second too long? What if their hands slipped from yours while you were still deciding? What would that do to you? Could you live with yourself knowing that you had the power to stop it and chose not to? Would the people you saved mean anything if the one person who made your life bearable was gone? Now imagine you do press it, the silence afterward, the light fading, the sudden stillness of a world ending. But they're still here, breathing, smiling, maybe confused. Maybe, maybe, alive. You hold them, you feel their warmth, and the world around you vanishes. Is it still love now, or is it something else? Something darker? Possession? Obsession? Is love still love when it kills everything but itself? And what about them? The one you saved? What happens when they learn what you did? Do they thank you, or do they crumble beneath the knowledge that their life came at the cost of every other? See! Do they scream? Do they run? Do they see you as a savior, or as a monster? You think you made the choice for love, but maybe you didn't. Maybe it was never about them at all. Maybe it was about your inability to let go, your refusal to feel that pain. Maybe saving them wasn't kindness, it was weakness. And now you live together in the ruins, just the two of you. No future, no strangers, no one to witness what happened. And every day they look at you with eyes you can't quite read. And you wonder if they're thinking the same thing you are. Was it worth it? Or maybe the worst possibility is simpler. Maybe they die anyway. Maybe you pressed the button, destroyed everything, and still couldn't save them. And now you are alone, with nothing, no world, no one. Just the memory of a face you loved, and the silence that followed your decision. You try to imagine doing it differently. You try to rewrite the moment, but you can't. Because once you knew the choice existed, it changed everything. The idea of it lives in you now, that you could trade the world for one person. That love, in its purest, rawest form, might demand the unforgivable. And now the question doesn't go away. It lingers, quiet, cold, permanent. Would you do it? And worse if you would, who exactly does that make you? How can someone be so intelligent and yet so wrong? You've met them before. The person who sees through every scam, every trap, every manipulation except their own. They're brilliant, articulate, impossibly quick. They analyze, debate, dismantle arguments with ease. But somehow, they believe in something absurd, something fragile, obvious, easily disprovable, and they hold on to it with a grip that defies logic. It doesn't make sense at first. You'd expect intelligence to be a shield, a tool for uncovering truth, avoiding error, resisting deception. But often, it's the opposite. Intelligence becomes a weapon turned inward. It justifies. It rationalizes. It builds elegant cages around falsehoods and calls them convictions. The smarter you are, the more skilled you become at defending your beliefs, not questioning them. You develop sharper arguments, better analogies, deeper references, not to discover the truth, but to win, to prove that you're right. And when you're rewarded for being right, being wrong becomes unbearable. So instead of changing your mind, you change the shape of the evidence. You twist it, reframe it. You use your intelligence to protect yourself from discomfort. Because the smarter you are, the better you are at lying to yourself and believing it. And it goes deeper. Smart people crave meaning, coherence. They want the world to make sense. They need patterns, causes, narratives. But the world isn't coherent. It's chaotic, messy, full of randomness and contradiction. And when you're smart, that dissonance becomes intolerable. So you invent systems to explain it. Complex ideologies, elaborate theories, psychological maps, all designed to turn confusion into clarity. But sometimes those systems are wrong. They oversimplify. They erase nuance. They become prisons. And the smarter you are, the more intricate the prison becomes, the more beautiful, the more convincing. You trap yourself inside your own creation, and you don't even realize it. And there's another trap, confidence. Intelligence breeds it. You're used to being right. People defer to you. They ask your opinion. They believe what you say. So over time, you stop questioning yourself. You mistake fluency for accuracy, articulation for truth. The ease with which you think becomes proof of your correctness. But thinking quickly isn't the same as thinking clearly. Being persuasive isn't the same as being right. And every time you win an argument, every time someone agrees with you, not because you're correct, but because you're clever, you drift a little further from reality. And then there's ego. The more intelligent you are, the more your identity gets built around it. You're the smart one, the rational one, the one who sees through the noise. So what happens when you're wrong? When the evidence contradicts you? When your beliefs collapse? You deny it, because accepting it would mean shattering not just a belief, but your entire self-image. You'd rather double down, blame others, reinterpret the facts, anything to avoid the unbearable thought that maybe you're not as perceptive as you believed. And if you're smart, you can do that. You can construct a world where you're never wrong, where every contradiction has an answer, where every flaw is part of the plan, and you'll believe it. Not because it's true, but because you're skilled enough to make it feel true. So intelligence becomes insulation, a buffer against doubt. And the smarter you are, the thicker that buffer becomes, until you're not seeing the world anymore. You're seeing your version of it, reinforced by logic, protected by argument, defended by pride. And here's the final twist. The more you believe you're immune to deception, the more vulnerable you become, because you stop checking, you stop questioning, you assume clarity where there is none. And the lies that slip through aren't the clumsy ones, they're the ones that flatter your intelligence. The ones that feel like insights. The ones that feel like insights. The ones that mirror your thinking so perfectly. You mistake them for your own. You're tricked because you're certain, because you can't imagine being fooled, because every warning sign looks like noise, every counterpoint feels like an attack, every challenge becomes a threat to your identity. And that's how it happens. Quietly, subtly, you drift away from truth, step by step, without ever noticing. And the whole time, you believe you're seeing more clearly than anyone else. Because the smarter you are, the harder it is to admit you've been deceived, and the easier it becomes to deceive yourself. What if the lie isn't meant for them, but for you? Not a deception you tell to manipulate others, not a mask to hide your intentions, but a lie that only works if you believe it too, fully. Deeply, without hesitation. You might think that kind of lie is rare. That self-deception is something to be avoided, a flaw in reasoning. But some roles, some identities demand it. They don't just ask you to act, they ask you to become the act. And if you don't, the illusion crumbles. Imagine a soldier who tells himself the cause is just, even when he knows it's not. He repeats it silently, day after day, because to admit doubt would paralyze him. He can't hesitate. He can't weigh every moral cost. If he does, he can't act. So he believes the lie, because believing it gives him the strength to continue. Or think of the parent who insists everything will be okay, even when the diagnosis says otherwise. They smile, they reassure, they cling to hope, not because they're naive, but because the child needs it. And for the child to believe it, the parent must believe it too, even if only for a while, even if it means turning away from truth. Sometimes the lie becomes the only way through, because the truth is too heavy, too uncertain, too full of doubt. But what makes these lies different is how quietly they take root. How easily belief slides from performance into something more. At first it's a choice, then a habit, then a need. And finally it becomes who you are. Not because the facts have changed, but because you've changed to fit the lie. This is what makes them so dangerous. You stop questioning. You stop checking. You no longer remember where the lie ends, and you begin. You're no longer lying to others. You've rewritten yourself. You might think this only happens in extreme situations, but look closer. You might already be doing it. Telling yourself you're okay when you're not. Convincing yourself that what you do matters, even when you suspect it doesn't. Believing that the people around you care more than they do. That you're in control. That you're the kind of person who would never compromise, never break. And maybe you believe these things because you need to. Because if you stop believing them, everything you've built starts to unravel. But here's the trap. If the lie needs your belief to survive, then you're trapped inside it. You can't examine it honestly, because doing so would kill it. And killing it would leave you exposed, empty, without the scaffolding that held you up. So the lie protects you, shields you, comforts you, but it also owns you. It dictates what you can see, what you can admit, what you can feel, and eventually it decides who you are allowed to become. Because the moment you start to believe it, really believe it, you stop being someone who's pretending. You become someone who can no longer tell the difference. And then, even if someone tried to show you the truth, you wouldn't listen. You'd reject it, defend yourself, protect the structure you've built. Not because you're dishonest, but because you've made the lie sacred, and challenging it feels like self-destruction. But sometimes, very quietly, a part of you knows. A tiny voice, easy to ignore. It whispers in the still moments when nothing is distracting you. It asks the question you work so hard not to hear. What if none of this is real? What if you've built everything on a foundation of fear, not truth? You brush it aside. You tighten the story. You tell yourself that doubt is weakness, that questioning will only bring pain. You remind yourself of everything that depends on your belief. And so you keep believing, even harder. But belief doesn't make it true. It only makes it harder to stop. And maybe that's the real cost. Not the lie itself, but the way it steals your ability to see clearly, to change, to walk away. Because some lies only work if you believe them too. And the moment you stop, everything they've protected begins to collapse, including you. Would you steal if your child was starving? Not in theory, not as an abstract ethical puzzle, but right now, your hands shaking, your child crying, your stomach hollow from guilt. The shelves are full, the clerk looks away. You can take it, walk out, feed them. But you were raised to believe stealing is wrong. You tell yourself that morality is the line that separates us from animals, that values matter, that there's always another way. But what if there isn't? What if you've already tried everything, every job, every favor, every prayer, and now the choice isn't between right and wrong? It's between your child surviving or not. In that moment, what happens to your morality? Does it bend or does it snap? You've told yourself you're a good person, but that belief has never been tested like this. Not really, because morality works best when life is stable, when your needs are met, when your survival isn't on the line. It's easy to believe in principles when they cost you nothing, when your world is comfortable, controlled, but pressure changes things, slowly. Then all at once, you tell yourself you'd never kill. But what if someone you love is threatened? You'd defend them, of course. You'd fight. And if it came to that, yes, maybe even kill. But then the line is already crossed, the principle already broken, the never already gone. It's not that morality disappears under pressure, it's that it reveals what it always was. A system we build for normal times. A structure designed to function in peace, in prosperity. But when those conditions disappear, the structure cracks, sometimes quietly, sometimes violently. And maybe you already feel it. The small compromises, the quiet justifications. A lie you told to avoid conflict. A cruelty you accepted because speaking up was dangerous. You've already made small trades, comfort for truth, safety for honesty, silence for justice. And each time the line moved, just a little, until the original line, what you swore you'd never cross, is gone, replaced by a new one, closer, easier. So what happens when pressure builds beyond that? When your job depends on saying nothing, when your safety depends on going along, when someone else's suffering becomes the cost of your survival. Do you still hold the line then? Or do you step over it, quietly, quickly, without looking back? You might think you'd resist, that when the moment comes, you'd stand firm. But what if resistance means isolation, poverty, fear? What if doing the right thing doesn't just hurt? It ruins you. How strong is your morality when it makes your life worse? We like to believe we're good because we choose to be. But often, we're good because we can afford to be, because it's easy, because it feels good. But real morality, the kind that costs something, that's rare, and under enough pressure, even that begins to erode. You start to wonder if morality was ever about right and wrong, or if it was always about survival, about staying clean. Not because it's right, but because it keeps you safe, because it preserves the version of yourself you want to believe in. But what happens when being clean means letting others suffer? When being good means letting bad things happen? What if morality, in the end, is just another luxury, one more thing people lose when the world turns cruel? And here's what's worse. Once you've crossed the line, once you've done the thing you said you'd never do, there's no going back, even if you had no choice, even if it saved someone you love, even if it was the only option left, you still did it. And now you live with that knowledge. Not just the guilt, but the fear. Fear of what you're capable of. Fear of what else you might do. Fear that the person you thought you were, kind, principled, decent, was never real. Just a version of you that existed in easier times. And so you learn something quietly horrifying. Morality isn't what you believe. It's what you can maintain when everything is falling apart. And once it's gone, it doesn't come back the same. It returns cracked, smaller, easier to ignore, and the next time you're under pressure, it breaks faster. Not because you've become worse, but because you've become honest. Because now you know the truth. Not everyone becomes a monster when pushed far enough. Some of us just become ourselves. What if you've never actually seen anything real? Not just once or twice, not just in dreams or hallucinations, but ever, every face you've looked into, every room you've sat in, every memory you've replayed. What if none of it was the thing itself, just a filtered echo, a translation, one version of many that your mind quietly decided to accept? You don't really see with your eyes, you see with your brain. The light hits your retina. Sure, but what happens after that is interpretation, correction, reconstruction. Your brain fills in gaps, smooths over inconsistencies, edits mistakes. It turns partial, delayed and distorted signals into something coherent enough to move through. But coherence isn't the same as truth. When you see color, you're not seeing color. You're seeing your brain's guess about how light at certain wavelengths should feel. When you see movement, you're not seeing motion as it happens. You're seeing a prediction stitched together from lagging signals, so it won't feel disjointed. You're always a fraction of a second behind the present, always looking at a cleaned-up version of the world. It feels real, but it isn't, and it never was. You can't unsee that once you know it. The solidness of the world becomes slippery. The edge between reality and illusion fades, not because the world changed, but because you started to notice how much you've been trusting a narrator inside your head. One that never shows you the raw footage, just the edited cut. Even your memories, those private archives of personal truth, aren't reliable. They're rewritten constantly, each time you recall them, reconstructed, revised, touched up to match your current beliefs and feelings. You remember remembering them, not the event itself. They're simulations too. And when you think you're seeing something clearly, when a person seems trustworthy or a situation feels familiar, you're not responding to the present. You're responding to predictions, shortcuts, patterns your brain learned long ago. You're not seeing them. You're seeing the model you've built of them. Even pain works like this. You feel it not where the injury is, but where your brain decides the signal should go. You can feel phantom limbs. You can have pain with no injury, or no pain where damage is real. Your body isn't lying. It's just being overruled by the simulation. All of this is meant to help you survive. That's the disturbing part. You don't see the world as it is. You see it in the way that keeps you functional, efficient, able to make quick judgments, not overwhelmed, not paralyzed. But that usefulness comes at a cost. The cost is truth. And the most dangerous part is this: you can't tell the difference. If your brain is wrong, if it edits reality to protect you, or comfort you, or make you act, you won't notice. The illusion isn't something you spot. It's something you live in, completely, silently, without question. So when someone tells you they see the world differently, maybe they're not deluded. Maybe they're just noticing the edits their own brain refuses to hide. Maybe they're not confused. Maybe they're just looking at a different version of the same lie. It raises a question no one wants to face. If every perception is just a construction, and every memory is a reconstruction, and every belief is based on those, what exactly is real? What do you actually know? Not believe, not feel. No, you can describe the world, measure it, photograph it. But even the instruments you use rely on assumptions, assumptions about how things behave. Assumptions your brain made long before you learned to ask. And still, you walk through the world as if it's solid, as if what you see is the thing itself, as if the face you love is the person behind it, as if the room you sit in is exactly where it appears to be. But every one of those impressions is filtered, interpreted, translated. Every shape, every sound, every word you think you hear. You don't experience reality. You experience the story your brain tells you about reality. And that story is shaped by your fears, your desires, your memories, your culture, your trauma, your need to belong, your terror of being alone. Even now, as you listen, you're not hearing me. You're hearing your version of me. You're assigning meaning to the words, filling in gaps, imagining a voice, a tone, a presence. I don't exist here, not really. Only your brain's version of me does. And maybe you're starting to wonder if this is true, if none of this is direct. What does that say about your past, your relationships, the moments that felt most real to you? Were they real, or were they interpretations that seemed consistent enough to believe? Maybe that's the trap. Not that you've been fooled once or twice, but that everything you've ever felt, feared, or loved might have been based on a version of the world that never actually existed. And maybe the only thing more disturbing than not knowing what's real is realizing you never did. What if doing nothing is the most violent choice you can make? Not neglect, not apathy, but a deliberate, conscious refusal to act. Not because you didn't know what to do, but because you couldn't decide. Because every option felt contaminated, and waiting felt safer than being wrong. So you stalled, you paused, you let the moment pass, and something irreversible happened. You might tell yourself you didn't cause it, that doing nothing is morally neutral, that it buys time, protects innocence, delays the damage, but the truth is harder. Every time you choose nothing, something still unfolds, people still hurt, outcomes still arrive, and they do so without your input, without your guidance, without your interference, but not without your responsibility. You already know this. Deep down, you've felt it before, the weight of an avoided decision, the slow-growing regret that seeps in afterward. At the time, silence felt clean, safer than speaking, safer than acting. But later, the consequences still arrived. And by then, it was too late to say you hadn't chosen. You had. You'd chosen not to decide. And that was its own decision, one you could never take back. Now imagine a moment like that, but larger. Imagine someone you love, begging you for help. You see they're in trouble. You see it clearly, but you hesitate. You tell yourself you're not sure what to say, or that you don't want to make it worse. So you wait. Days pass, weeks, eventually the moment for help is gone. Maybe they're gone too. And now the silence isn't protective, it's permanent. You didn't cause their pain. You didn't push them toward it. But you saw it coming, and you did nothing. Can you live with that? Sometimes the most haunting part of inaction isn't what happened to others, it's what it reveals about you. The excuses you reach for, the comfort you protect, the truths you avoid seeing. You tell yourself it's compassion, or caution, or neutrality. But often it's fear. Fear of doing the wrong thing. Fear of being judged. Fear of seeing yourself more clearly. So you wait. You let time move forward, hoping the problem will dissolve on its own. But it doesn't. It grows. Quietly, invisibly, but undeniably. And when the moment finally passes beyond repair, you realize something has changed inside you too. You've learned how easy it is to let harm unfold while your hands stay clean. And you can't unlearn that. That's the cost of choosing nothing. It changes how you see yourself. You begin to understand that silence doesn't shield you from guilt. It just delays the moment you feel it. And when it arrives, it carries something sharp. The realization that the thing you feared doing might have been the only thing that could have mattered. Maybe you've already had moments like this. Moments you revisit late at night, wondering what would have happened if you'd spoken, if you'd acted, if you'd risked being wrong. You play them over and over, imagining different outcomes, but they don't change. They sit there, fixed in time, as proof that you stood still when movement was needed. And that's the part that stays with you. Not the chaos, not the outcome, but the stillness, the terrible quiet of your own refusal to choose. Even worse is when no one else knows. When the world moves on, unaware of the decision you didn't make. There's no punishment, no blame, just the slow private corrosion of your own certainty. You start questioning yourself in other situations. You hesitate more, you doubt your instincts. You become quieter, smaller, afraid of reaching again for something that might demand a choice. And over time, you realize something else has been lost. The ability to believe you'd do the right thing, not just once, but ever. Because you've now lived the moment where right and wrong were in front of you, and you stepped back, And now you carry that version of yourself everywhere. The one who waited, the one who watched, the one who let it happen. And no matter how much you grow, no matter how much you try to forgive yourself, that moment becomes part of you. Not like a wound, but like a mirror, a reflection you return to in every moment of hesitation, a reminder of what it costs to let fear decide for you. Not acting feels safer. It feels easier. It feels neutral, but it isn't. The consequences still unfold, the damage still happens, and it does so without your voice, without your effort, without your conscience present in the room. And you feel that absence, not just in what you didn't do, but in who you failed to be. You'll never know what could have happened if you'd acted, but you'll always know what didn't happen, because you didn't. And that knowledge won't fade. It won't soften. It won't let go. Because once you've learned what it feels like to let something break while you stood still, you never forget it. You can rationalize it. You can bury it. But you can't unknow it. And you can't stop it from changing you. Quietly, permanently, irreversibly. Would you save a drowning child if it meant letting 100 others die? Not metaphorically, not abstractly. One child in front of you, slipping beneath the water. 100 others, faceless, distant, unknown, but real. If you act now, the child survives, but doing so triggers something else. A system, a ripple, a consequence, and you know what will follow. 100 lives erased, quietly, automatically, without spectacle. Their futures gone, not in front of you, not in your reach, but real. Your instinct is immediate. Save the child. It's visceral, emotional, human. You can see their face, hear them, gasp, feel the cold panic rising in your chest. You don't think, you move. Because right now, in this moment, there is no complexity, just a life in need, a person right in front of you. But the numbers don't disappear. The logic doesn't vanish. Somewhere, somehow, you know the exchange. One life for many. 1,000 futures swallowed by your compassion. And you start to wonder, what did you really save? We like to think saving a life is always good, always noble, always right. But that belief only holds when the consequences are hidden, when there's no price tag, no trade, no shadow cast behind your choice. Saving one life feels like a miracle. But what if it's a theft? What if that child grows up to do nothing remarkable, just an ordinary life, while the 100 you sacrificed included a surgeon who would have cured a disease, a parent who would have raised a child who changed the world, a scientist, a teacher, a leader, all gone, all erased, in an instant, you called heroic. You didn't kill them, you didn't see their faces. You'll never know their names, but the moment you reached into the water, you made a decision about the future, not just yours, not just theirs, everyone's. This isn't about utilitarianism. It's not about math. It's about the weight of choice when you're only given proximity, not perspective. When the life in front of you overwhelms the logic that trails behind, you tell yourself you couldn't do otherwise, that you acted out of love, out of decency, out of humanity. But you're starting to see the cracks in that story. You're starting to realize how often morality is just vision narrowed by urgency. How often we define good by what we can reach, not by what we destroy in the process. Would you still save the child if you knew the 100 would include your own descendants, your friends, your future? Would your hands still move so quickly, or would you hesitate? And if you hesitate now, what does that mean? That some lives are worth more than others. That value can be ranked by blood, or dreams, or potential. That morality bends once you personalize the cost. Maybe the hardest part isn't the decision. Maybe it's the realization that decisions like this happen all the time, hidden behind policy, economics, systems too large to feel. People are saved, people are sacrificed. We just rarely see the mechanism, rarely hear the splash. But today, you saw it. And maybe you'll save the child again. Maybe you'll do it 1,000 times. Because how could you not? But now you'll know, with every act of compassion, there may be a wake, a cost you never see, lives you never meet, futures you quietly erase to protect the one life you couldn't let go. And that's the part that stays with you. Not the child, but the silence of the 1,000 futures that never came to be. Why is it so easy to care, in theory, but so difficult in practice? You see a story online, a child in pain, a family in ruin, a stranger begging for help. And in that moment, you feel something, a quiet pull, a soft ache. A part of you wants to help. You tell yourself you would, if you could. You imagine yourself stepping in, doing something meaningful, being the kind of person who doesn't look away. But then you do. You close the tab, you scroll past, you think of something else, something easier, and just like that, the feeling fades. It's not that you didn't care, you did, for a moment. But care alone isn't action. Empathy alone isn't effort. What matters is what you do when care becomes inconvenient. Maybe you tell yourself it's not your fault, that the problem is too far away, too complicated, too endless. You wouldn't ignore someone suffering in front of you. You'd help if it were urgent, if it were close, if it really mattered. But it is close, and it does matter. You just don't want to pay the cost, because real empathy isn't free. It takes time. It takes energy. Sometimes it takes money, discomfort, or a shift in priorities. And in those moments, the kind of person you are reveals itself, not in your feelings, but in your thresholds. Where exactly does your care begin to flicker and fade? Is it when the problem interrupts your schedule? When it makes you late? When it costs more than you expected? When it challenges something you'd rather not think about? You like to think of yourself as good. You think of empathy as a constant, something you carry with you always. But if that empathy only functions when it's easy, what is it really? Maybe you help a friend move, but ignore a homeless person on the street. Maybe you donate to causes when they trend online, but stay silent when the issue becomes politically uncomfortable. Maybe you listen with compassion until someone asks more than you're willing to give. The line is always there, quiet, unmarked, invisible until it's crossed. You want to believe that empathy is your nature. But what if it's just your habit? A learned performance that disappears the moment it becomes burdensome. You tell yourself you're not cold. You're just tired, busy, overwhelmed. But somehow you're never too tired for what matters most to you. You're never too tired for comfort, for entertainment, for convenience. You're only tired when the cost of caring becomes personal. And maybe that's the truth you've been avoiding. That your empathy has limits, not moral ones, not philosophical, but practical. That the boundary of your compassion isn't shaped by belief, but by inconvenience. The moment someone needs too much, stays too long, asks too often, that's when you start to look away. And when you do act, when you help, when you give, it's often not because it's right, but because it's manageable. Because it fits into your life without too much disruption. You don't help until helping feels safe. But the people who need help the most aren't safe to help. They ask for more than you're ready to give. They test your patience. They shatter your schedule. They make you confront the version of yourself you don't want to see, the one who turns away when giving starts to hurt. And now you're forced to ask yourself, what kind of empathy is that? Is it real if it breaks so easily? Is it care if it only exists in comfort? What do you become when your compassion disappears? The moment it's inconvenient. You imagine yourself in another world, one where you're better, more generous, more reliable. But that world doesn't exist. Only this one does. And in this world, people suffer not because no one cares, but because care isn't strong enough to survive conflict with convenience. You've told yourself you'd act in a crisis, but you already live among quiet, daily crises. The neighbor you ignore, the news you silence, the guilt you reframe as helplessness. You see them, you just don't want to be disrupted, because deep down, you don't want empathy to demand anything from you. You want it to feel good. You want to believe it makes you kind without making you tired. You want it to affirm your goodness, not expose your limits. But real empathy doesn't protect you. It interrupts you. It ruins your plans. It asks you to lose sleep, spend money, feel drained, change your habits. And most days, that's too much. So instead, you choose what feels enough, a share, a like, a thought. You pretend that wanting to help is the same as helping, that meaning well is close enough, but it's not. And maybe the most uncomfortable truth isn't that your empathy has limits. It's that you already know exactly where those limits are, and you live comfortably within them. Every day, without question, without guilt, without change, until someone asks again, and you look away. You think the problem was the decision, that if you could just go back, change a word, pause a little longer, choose differently, things would be fine, but go deeper. Picture yourself back in that moment. Really imagine it. The room, the air, the feeling in your chest, the tension between what you wanted and what you feared. You see yourself standing at the edge of the same mistake, heart quickening, hands unsure. Now ask yourself honestly, what would you actually do differently? Because even with all the pain that followed, even knowing exactly what happened, a part of you still believes you were right to choose the way you did. Or if not right, then at least understandable, justified, inevitable. You made that choice because of who you were, your fears, your desires, the way the moment felt from the inside. Not how it looks now, standing safely outside it. That's the trap. You imagine yourself rewinding time with perfect clarity. But the person going back isn't the wiser version of you now, it's still you then. The same thoughts, the same blind spots, the same need for control or approval or comfort. Nothing changed. You wouldn't choose differently because you couldn't have. Not really. It's not about ignorance. It's not about missing some crucial piece of information. You had enough to pause, enough to resist, enough to wait, but you didn't. You didn't want to. And even if you tell yourself now that you regret it, that you'd do anything to undo it, the truth is murkier. Some part of you still thinks it wasn't a mistake at all. It was a move you had to make, for love, for pride, for fear of what not acting might reveal about you. So imagine it again. The clock resets, time rewinds, everything slows. You stand in the same hallway, or you pick up the same phone, or you look at the same face, about to speak, and you still make the same call, because there's something in you, buried, quiet, that needs to see how far this goes, that believes pain is better than uncertainty, that believes the only way to stay in control is to follow the pattern all the way to the end. That's what makes this so disturbing. Not that you made a mistake, but that given another chance, you'd still make it, willingly, calmly, with the same trembling hands and the same heavy breath, you'd find a new justification, a new excuse, a new way to convince yourself it was different this time, even as everything unfolds exactly the same. And maybe what hurts most isn't the outcome. It's knowing how deeply you needed the outcome to be different, while still walking the same path to get there. Because the real horror isn't failing once. It's discovering that failure is a part of you, that you carry the conditions for the mistake inside you always, that every next time might already be written. So even if the universe gave you a reset, even if it whispered in your ear, "This is the moment," even if it begged you to choose again, you wouldn't listen. You'd think you were doing the right thing. You'd feel the same pull, the same pressure. You'd find the same story to tell yourself, and you'd nod and act and believe, and then watch it all fall apart again. Because the truth is, you didn't make the mistake by accident. You made it because some part of you needed to, and maybe you still do. What if you're wrong about who you are? Not because someone lied to you, not because you were manipulated, but because the more you think, the more the foundation cracks. You try to reason your way through a problem, weigh the pros and cons, examine your memories, analyze your instincts. But the deeper you dig, the less stable it feels, like the answers you reach are too easy or too convenient. Like maybe you're not discovering truth at all. Maybe you're just justifying whatever you already wanted to believe. You trust your thoughts because they're yours. But have you ever stopped to ask where they come from, what they're built on? You tell yourself you're logical, that you think critically. But logic only works if your assumptions are solid, and most of the time you never even notice what those assumptions are. You believe you're a good person. You believe you want what's best. But under pressure, those beliefs get blurry. A choice you thought was obvious suddenly becomes impossible. You question your motivations. Was it really compassion or cowardice? Was it integrity or pride? The more you try to clarify, the more uncertain it becomes. You replay decisions in your head. You try to explain them, to justify them, to make them make sense. But every answer leads to another question. Every reason has a counterpoint. You think you're making progress, but all you're really doing is circling deeper into confusion. And eventually, a new fear emerges. Not that you made the wrong choice, but that you don't even know what right means anymore. You thought that thinking would help, that understanding yourself would bring clarity. But sometimes thinking only sharpens the contradictions. It shows you the gaps, the inconsistencies, the tiny betrayals you commit without noticing. You catch yourself in a lie, not to someone else, but to yourself. A belief you claimed to hold until it became inconvenient. A principle you stood for until it cost too much. And you wonder, how many times have you done this without realizing? How many beliefs are just performances? You go back further. You think about childhood memories, ideas planted in you by parents, teachers, friends. You start to notice which parts of you were chosen and which were installed. You question your tastes, your fears, your desires. You try to trace the line between what you want and what you were trained to want. But the line isn't clear. It blurs. It vanishes. You think more. You try to be honest. You try to find solid ground. But the harder you search, the more hollow everything feels. You lose confidence, not just in your thoughts, but in the process of thinking itself. Because it doesn't always lead to truth. Sometimes it leads to paralysis, or manipulation, or rationalizations, so convincing. They feel like insight. You can argue anything, if you're clever enough. You can believe anything if it helps you sleep. And now you're not sure what you believe. You don't even know if your beliefs are real or just constructions. Temporary alliances between emotion and logic. Agreements made in desperation. You try to stop, to quiet the noise, but even that decision feels suspect. Is it wisdom or surrender? Is it peace or avoidance? You used to think that doubt was a sign of depth, that questioning yourself made you stronger. But now the questions won't stop, and they're not making you stronger. They're making you afraid. Because if you can't trust your thoughts and you can't trust your feelings, then what part of you is left to trust? You start to see yourself not as a person, but as a machine, a pattern, a system responding to inputs. Trauma, reward, habit. What you call decisions might just be echoes. What you call identity might just be momentum. You try to be still, to listen, to find something stable. But all you hear is static. And that's when it hits you. You're not afraid of being wrong. You're afraid that even your fear might be fake. That the voice in your head isn't a guide, it's a mask. That every time you think, you're getting further from something honest, something simple, something lost. And the more you think about that, the less you trust yourself. Imagine you're driving home. It's late, the road is empty, quiet, almost comforting. You've had a long day, and your thoughts drift. You're not distracted exactly, but you're not fully present either. Then, out of nowhere, someone crosses the road. Fast, too fast. You slam the brakes, but it's too late. They don't move, and neither do you. You sit there, hands trembling on the wheel, staring at what you've done. It was an accident. You didn't mean for it to happen, but that doesn't change the fact that it did. And now everything is different, not because you've died, but because someone else has. And you were the cause, you want to believe. This doesn't define you. You're not a bad person. You didn't plan this. You didn't choose it. It was a moment, a mistake. But as the sirens grow louder and the flashing lights approach, a quieter realization begins to settle in. The world doesn't always care about intention. Someone is dead and you're alive, and for the rest of your life, that will follow you. You'll be seen differently, judged differently. Maybe not by everyone, but by some. Maybe even by the people who matter most. Maybe even by yourself. And here's where the trap begins. You think of villains as people who plan harm, people who choose cruelty. But what if that's not how it works? What if becoming the villain isn't about the choices you make, but about the damage you cause, whether you meant to or not? What if it only takes one mistake to change your role in someone else's story? Not because you wanted it, not because you deserve it, but because it happened. And now there's no going back. You'll apologize. You'll explain. You'll replay the moment 1,000 times in your head, looking for something you missed, something you could have done differently. But no matter how carefully you speak, no matter how much pain you carry, it won't change what you are to someone else now. To them, you're the reason. And once that identity is formed, it's almost impossible to unmake. You can try to rebuild your life. You can do good things, be kind, be generous. But the shadow of that moment will stretch long behind you. Some people will never see anything else. And worse, there will be days you don't either. You start to understand how fragile your identity really is. How quickly the story you tell about yourself can collapse. You believed you were a good person, careful, kind, moral. But now you see how thin that belief was, how easily it can be rewritten by a single event. You tell yourself it was just bad luck, wrong place, wrong time. But that doesn't help, because it means you never had control. It means anyone could become what you've become. Not because they're evil, but because they're human. And that's the part no one wants to admit. You think of villains as something outside yourself, a different kind of person. But they aren't. They're just people who couldn't undo what they did. People who were in the wrong place, made the wrong call, or simply didn't see something in time. And maybe that's you now. Not because you wanted to hurt anyone, but because you did. And maybe the only difference between you and the people you've always judged is that until now, you never had to find out what you're capable of. You never had to see yourself through the eyes of someone who's lost everything because of you. You always thought morality was about intention. But now you wonder if that was just a way to feel safe. A way to believe you were immune from becoming something you feared. You're not immune, none of us are. And now you live with the unbearable weight of that knowledge. That the distance between who you were and who you are now was only 1 second, one mistake, one accident. And the worst part isn't what others think of you. It's what you're starting to think of yourself. What if you've never truly told the truth? Not because you meant to lie, not because you're deceitful, but because the version of events you live through, the one you remember, the one you retell, is always tilted slightly in your favor. You forget the details that make you look worse. You misremember the moments that make others look better. You turn pain into justification, and over time it all starts to feel real. This is the strange part. You believe it. Entirely. You don't think of yourself as lying. You think of yourself as honest, even self-critical. But deep down, you're editing constantly, filtering what fits, discarding what doesn't, shaping a version of reality that feels both accurate and safe. And the more often you tell the story, the more solid it becomes. Not because it's true, but because you need it to be. You've seen this in others. You've watched someone twist a story, omit a detail, exaggerate just enough to change the tone. You hear it, and you feel a small, quiet unease, but they don't seem to notice. They're not trying to deceive you, they've just convinced themselves. And still, you rarely suspect the same of yourself. Because when you remember your own life, you assume you're the reliable narrator. You assume your memories are mostly accurate, your feelings mostly justified, your choices mostly reasonable. You give yourself the benefit of the doubt. You explain your mistakes with context. You soften your cruelty with excuses. And you don't even realize you're doing it. It happens slowly. One small revision at a time. You shift a motive slightly. You forget a warning someone gave you. You remember the words they said, but not the tone. And suddenly, their rejection feels colder. Your reaction feels fairer. Your anger, more righteous. Your regret, more distant. Eventually, the version of events you live with becomes something different, something safer, something more useful to your sense of self. And the longer you live with it, the harder it becomes to question. Even when someone confronts you, says, "That's not how it happened," your first reaction isn't doubt. It's defense. You feel cornered. You accuse them of forgetting, of misinterpreting. Would misinterpreting, of rewriting the past to fit their narrative. Because that's what you think they're doing, not what you think you're doing. But what if you are? What if every story you've ever told about your past is a version shaped to protect you from shame? What if the worst thing you've done is something you've already buried, not just from others, but from yourself? And if that's true, how would you ever know? You imagine you'd recognize it. You imagine that guilt would rise up, that the truth would force its way back in. But memory doesn't work like that. It isn't a mirror, it's a collage. It's a patchwork of impressions, guesses, and revisions. And when something doesn't fit the story you want to believe, it fades, quietly, permanently. So maybe the truth isn't that some people lie and some don't. Maybe the truth is that everyone lies to themselves first. And maybe the only difference between you and the people you don't trust is that they believe a different version of the lie. You think of the times you were certain, times you defended yourself, insisted you were right, times you felt betrayed, misunderstood, wronged. How many of those moments were based on something real, and how many were built on stories you didn't know you were writing? It's not that your feelings weren't real. Pain is always real, but the cause of it, the meaning of it, might not be. And that's the problem. You might be living inside a narrative that makes you feel righteous, but isn't true. One where you're the misunderstood one, the thoughtful one, the one who tried their best while others failed you. One where you see clearly, act wisely, mean well. But if you are the unreliable narrator, you wouldn't know it. You couldn't. Because the story you're telling feels true, feels right, feels earned. So now you have to ask, if you are lying to yourself, what would that lie sound like? It wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be obvious. It would be quiet, subtle, hidden inside your justifications, your defensiveness, your certainty. It would be the feeling that you don't need to question yourself, that the real problem is how others refuse to understand you, that your choices were always reasonable, given what you knew. But that's exactly how the lie protects itself. And now you're left with a disturbing possibility, that your entire self-image, your sense of being fair, honest, and well-intentioned, rests on a foundation that isn't stable. That the version of yourself you live with isn't entirely real. And if that's true, then everything you believe about your life, your past, your identity, is just a carefully managed illusion. Not because you're a bad person, but because the truth, unfiltered, would be too painful to live with, too complicated to carry, too different from the story you need to survive. And now the question isn't whether you're lying. The question is, how long have you been lying, without even knowing? Imagine you could remember every detail of your life perfectly. Every face you've seen, every conversation, every mistake. Nothing ever fades. You remember it all. At first, that sounds like a gift, like something you'd want. No more forgetting names, no more misplacing your keys, no more struggling to recall where you left off or what you meant to say. Everything crystal clear. Every second of your life accessible in an instant. But think about what else that means. It means you remember every insult, every humiliation, every argument that made your voice shake, every betrayal that hollowed you out. Not vaguely, not as a feeling, but exactly. You remember the tone of their voice, the way their eyes didn't meet yours, the precise moment you realized what they were doing. You remember every pain, not as a scar, but as a wound that never closes. There's no forgetting, no softening with time, no distance. The people who hurt you are as vivid in your mind today as they were the moment it happened. And when you try to move on, something inside you pulls you back. Not out of choice, not out of obsession, but because your brain won't let go. You live each day carrying all the weight of every other day. The grief you felt 5 years ago, the fear from a decade ago, the shame from childhood. It doesn't fade, it doesn't become memory, it stays present, always right behind your eyes, waiting. And it's not just pain, it's everything. Every moment you embarrassed yourself, every time you said too much or not enough. Every opportunity you missed, every time someone looked at you with disappointment, every second that once felt small now lives on, permanently magnified. And you can't change how you felt. That version of you is trapped in that moment, preserved forever. You see them again and again, the younger versions of yourself, confused, afraid, pretending. You feel what they felt without escape. Other people heal because time erases. For you, time only adds. You stop forgiving, not out of cruelty, but because forgiveness requires forgetting. Not entirely, but enough to loosen the grip. But you can't loosen anything. You remember what they said, what they meant, what they did when they thought you weren't looking. You remember their exact words, their breath, the sound of the silence. After, even joy becomes strange. You remember moments of happiness so vividly that they begin to feel fake, as if the present can't compete with the precision of the past. You find yourself chasing feelings that were once real, now unreachable, suspended in a perfect snapshot you can never re-enter. And when people change, you don't. Not in your mind, because you still see them as they were. Still hear what they said, still feel what they made you feel. You try to relate to who they are now, but the past version of them keeps speaking, keeps interrupting. Perfect memory means every version of every person exists, all at once, and none of them ever leave. You become unable to live in the moment, because the moment never stands alone. Every new experience overlaps with the old ones. You meet someone new, and your brain compares them to everyone who came before. You hear echoes, you see patterns. You make connections that feel like certainty, but might just be fear dressed up as insight. You never truly rest. Your mind stays active, replaying, cross-referencing, searching for meaning in things long over. And eventually, you start to doubt what's real now. Not because your memory is faulty, but because it's too exact. You remember how someone used to make you feel, and even if they've changed, you can't escape the memory of who they were. So your trust becomes cautious. Your affection becomes careful. Your love becomes conditional, filtered through the lens of everything they've ever done. You begin to question your identity. Not in some abstract way, but precisely. You remember the times you were cruel, the moments you were selfish, the things you thought when no one else could hear. You can't rewrite them. You can't soften the edges. You live with the clearest, coldest record of your worst moments, knowing they're not gone, they're just behind you, watching. People say we are shaped by our memories, but what if memory doesn't shape you? It traps you. What if it makes you less human, not more? Because to be human is to forget, slowly, gently, to remember just enough, to blur the edges, to let time do its work. But if you remember everything, time does nothing. And maybe that's the curse, not remembering what happened, but never being able to believe that it's over. Imagine someone took away your freedom, and you didn't even notice. You still go where you want, say what you want, choose who to love, how to live, what to believe. It feels like freedom. You aren't chained, you aren't trapped. There are no guards, no locked doors, so how could you not be free? But think carefully. Try to remember the last time you made a decision that wasn't shaped, quietly, invisibly, by something outside you. Every opinion you hold, every desire you chase, every fear that stops you from doing something. Where did it come from? Maybe you think it came from you. From your personality, your values, your instincts, but none of those appeared from nowhere. You were taught to be the person you are now, shaped by voices you don't even remember. Parents, teachers, culture, media, and even when you thought you were rebelling, choosing for yourself, weren't you still reacting to the very things you claimed to resist? The shape of your life is a reaction, a path laid down by patterns you didn't create. Every belief feels personal, because that's how the illusion works. It wraps itself around your identity until you forget there was ever anything outside it. Freedom means choice. But what if your choices were already chosen for you? Not by force, not by violence, but by suggestion, by pressure so quiet, so persistent, that you mistook it for your own voice. You avoid discomfort, Not because you've decided to, but because you've been trained to. You chase approval, not because it fulfills you, but because it feels safer than rejection. You tell yourself you're making your own way, but always within boundaries that were drawn long before you understood what they meant. And the walls are invisible for a reason. If you could see them, you might question them. You might press against them. But when the barrier is disguised as common sense, or tradition, or just how things are, you never think to resist. You confuse comfort with freedom, familiarity with choice, routine with control. Ask yourself how much of your life you've truly chosen. The clothes you wear, the food you crave, the people you admire, the kind of success you imagine for yourself. Were those choices built from scratch, or were they assembled from fragments handed to you, piece by piece, until they felt inevitable? You believe you're free because no one is forcing you to act differently. But what if force isn't necessary? What if all it takes is reward and punishment, drip-fed over years, shaping your impulses until the path of least resistance becomes the only one you see? Even your morality, your sense of right and wrong, was it discovered or delivered? Can you be sure it's yours at all? Try stepping outside the invisible walls. Try holding a belief no one around you shares. Try rejecting the patterns that gave you identity. The moment you do, the pressure becomes visible. The consequences start piling up. You lose comfort, approval, safety. And then you understand your freedom was never free. It was a bargain, a set of permitted behaviors in exchange for belonging. You might still feel free because the system doesn't need to constrain you with threats. It just needs to convince you there's nothing outside the cage. And when someone does escape, someone truly lives beyond the norms, they look terrifying. Not because they're dangerous, but because they reveal how much more was possible all along. They show that your life could have been different, and that realization is unbearable. You don't want to see the bars because you're afraid of what they protect you from. Chaos, uncertainty, the responsibility of making real, open-ended choices without a script to follow. So you settle, not because you're weak, but because you've been trained to feel safer inside the limits. You believe the walls are there to keep danger out, but maybe they were built to keep you in. The most disturbing part isn't that someone else drew these boundaries. It's that now you defend them. You police your own thoughts. You suppress the parts of yourself that don't fit the narrative. You protect the illusion of freedom, even when it betrays you. And even if you do catch a glimpse of the truth, you hesitate. Because stepping beyond the walls means losing everything familiar. Every comfort, every role, every certainty you've built your life around. But if you never step out, you'll never know what you might have been. You'll live a life that feels chosen, but only because the choices were made for you long ago. And maybe the real reason you cling to the illusion isn't because it's comforting, but because you've forgotten how to imagine anything else. Do you ever wonder how many moments in your life never really happened the way you remember them? You're certain they did. You have the images, the words, the feelings. But your certainty is not proof. It's construction. Your brain builds stories from fragments, some real, some borrowed, some invented, and stitches them together with absolute confidence. Not because it wants to lie to you, but because it needs the world to make sense. And when something doesn't fit, your mind quietly edits it out. You think of memory as a recording, something stable, permanent. But it's more like a rough draft, constantly rewritten every time you revisit it. Each recall is a chance to revise, distort, erase, and your brain does this without asking you. It smooths the edges, cleans up the contradictions, inserts motives, invents coherence. It's not just remembering, it's directing, curating, cutting scenes that feel too uncomfortable, too inconsistent with the story you need to believe. Think about an argument you had years ago. You remember what you said, how reasonable you were. But what if you were cruel? What if you said something you'd rather forget? The memory has been edited, not maliciously, but protectively, to preserve your sense of self, to guard your narrative. You didn't choose to forget, it just faded into the background, replaced by a version where you're slightly better, slightly more justified. It doesn't stop with memory. Your attention, your perception, your interpretation of everything you see, they're all shaped by that same inner director. You walk through the world, assuming what you see is what exists. But you're not seeing everything. You're seeing what your mind allows, what it highlights, what it wants to notice. The rest is filtered out, not because it's irrelevant, but because it contradicts the story. And when you do notice contradictions, when something breaks the frame, your brain rushes to resolve it. It invents context, reshapes meaning, fills in gaps. You see someone scowl and decide they're angry. But maybe they're in pain or remembering something else. Your mind doesn't care. It picks the story that feels right, fits best, hurts least. And once it chooses, it commits. You don't question it because it feels so obviously true. You call this intuition. But often it's just bias, preference dressed up as insight. You feel someone is untrustworthy, and then you notice all the little signs confirming it. Their tone, their glance, their silence. But you ignore the signs that don't fit. You're not being objective. You're building a case. You're watching your own internal movie. And every scene reinforces the plot you've already accepted. And the deeper you go, the harder it is to see it happening. You stop noticing the edits. The gaps feel natural. The lies feel like facts. You don't realize that reality has been shaped not by the world outside, but by the story inside. And when someone challenges that story, you don't just disagree, you feel attacked, because they're not arguing with your opinion. They're threatening your identity. And so you defend it, not with logic, but with instinct. You double down, dig deeper, become more certain, even when the evidence falls apart. Because to admit the story might be wrong is to admit you might be wrong. That your certainty was built on incomplete data, selective memory, unconscious edits. And that feels unbearable. So instead, you protect the story. You remember it more vividly. You tell it more often. You shape your life around it. And without realizing it, you become trapped, not by lies told to you, but by lies you've told yourself. So often, they no longer feel like lies at all. But here's the part that's hardest to accept. This isn't a flaw. It's how the mind works. Everyone does it. Even now, you're doing it. Interpreting these words through the lens of your existing beliefs, choosing what to absorb, what to dismiss. You think you're listening with an open mind, but you're not. You're listening with a mind that wants to stay consistent, stay stable, stay safe, even if that means turning away from the truth. And maybe you can never fully escape that. Maybe there's no such thing as pure perception. Only fragments of reality, rearranged by the quiet, tireless editor inside your head, cutting what hurts, rewriting what confuses, directing the story you need to believe, just to keep going. And maybe that's the most unsettling part. Not that your brain lies to you, but that you need it to. What happens when someone uses logic to justify something cruel and they wear a lab coat while doing it? It doesn't feel like malice. It feels like science, like reason, like clarity. They speak in calm, measured tones. They reference data, patterns, probabilities. The words sound neutral, unemotional, sterile. And that's what makes it so dangerous. Because when harm is delivered with a quiet voice and a clean coat, it doesn't look like harm at all. You've seen this before, maybe not in person, but in the way decisions get made. A doctor decides not to resuscitate an elderly patient because the survival odds are low. A psychologist dismisses someone's pain as statistically insignificant. A policymaker prioritizes efficiency over compassion. None of them are trying to be cruel. They're just following the logic. And logic feels safe. It feels like the opposite of chaos. So you trust it. You defer to it. You tell yourself it's better this way. Rational, calculated, immune to emotional mistakes. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because logic doesn't feel pain. Logic doesn't know what it's like to be left out of the equation. Logic doesn't care who gets left behind, as long as the numbers add up. That's when the contradiction begins to form. You're told that feelings cloud judgment, that emotional decisions are dangerous. But when someone cuts emotion out completely, they don't become wise, they become blind. They lose the ability to see people as people. They only see systems, variables, cost-benefit curves. You stop being a person. You become a case. It's subtle at first. A study says people with certain disorders are more likely to commit crimes, so precautions are recommended. A graph shows which populations drain the most resources, so funding gets reallocated. No one feels responsible. No one feels unkind. They're just being logical. But the logic leads to outcomes, cold ones, outcomes that hurt people. Not because anyone meant to, but because no one paused to feel. Now you start to notice something else. Emotion isn't the opposite of logic. It's what keeps logic from becoming inhuman. Without it, logic doesn't become more accurate. It becomes more dangerous. Because it can justify anything. It can explain why a certain group should be deprioritized. It can defend the suffering of a few for the benefit of many. It can turn atrocities into strategy, and it will always sound convincing. You hear the phrase "for the greater good," and it stops feeling noble. It starts to sound like a warning, because you realize that the greater good always depends on who's doing the math and who gets counted, and who gets ignored. Logic wears a lab coat, but it doesn't wear a conscience. It follows rules, not empathy. Now imagine being on the wrong side of that calculation. You're not productive enough, not healthy enough, not rational enough. You're a variable that doesn't fit the model, and no one hates you, no one targets you. You're just quietly excluded, quietly denied, quietly forgotten, because someone else ran the numbers and you didn't make the cut. It's tempting to believe this is rare, that it only happens in extreme situations. But that's part of the illusion. The more calmly it's done, the less it looks like harm. You think of institutions that make life and death decisions daily, about who gets care, who gets parole, who gets help. They claim objectivity. But every decision is shaped by assumptions, priorities, and values. And the moment those values are removed, logic becomes something colder, something sharper. You want to believe there's a way to be purely rational, to make decisions that are completely fair, completely correct. But what if fairness requires feelings? What if accuracy without compassion is just a more efficient kind of cruelty? Now you start to feel the edges of this trap. The idea that emotion makes you weak has been planted so deeply that you don't question it. You hide your instincts. You second-guess your compassion. You try to sound more logical, more neutral, more correct. And in doing so, you slowly give away the one thing that makes logic safe, the ability to feel, because logic is a tool, not a guide. It can tell you how to get somewhere, but not whether you should. It can maximize an outcome, but not tell you if the outcome is good. That's the part emotion plays, not as a flaw, but as a safeguard. And yet, we still praise the person who makes hard decisions without flinching. We call them strong, brave, rational, even when those decisions quietly destroy lives. Because it's easier to trust the person in the lab coat than to confront what their choices really mean. So now you ask yourself, if logic fails when emotions wear lab coats, then who's really in control? Is it the person making the decision, or the system that taught them not to feel? And what happens when that system grows, scales, becomes the standard for how choices are made? What happens when no one questions it anymore? What happens when harm feels like policy? When cruelty feels like protocol? What happens when the people who feel the consequences are the only ones still feeling at all? What if knowing the truth didn't set you free, but destroyed you? Not instantly, not violently, but slowly, quietly, like a splinter you can't remove. At first, it's just discomfort, then irritation, then something deeper, something you can't ignore. The truth isn't dramatic. It doesn't scream. It whispers. It hums in the background, changing the way everything sounds. You think you want it. You think uncovering the truth is noble, enlightening. But sometimes truth is heavier than lies. It doesn't elevate you. It buries you. You ask for clarity. You get corrosion. Because the moment you see the full picture, you can't unsee it. Every comfort becomes artificial. Every reassurance feels hollow. Imagine discovering that the people around you never truly loved you for who you are, only for who they thought you were. That every word of support, every moment of connection was based on a false image, a misunderstanding. You were never truly known, only approximated. Once you know that, how do you go back? Or imagine realizing your entire identity. The stories you told yourself about your strength, your kindness, your goodness was built on selective memory. You remember your compassion, but not your apathy. Your intentions, but not your effects. What if you finally see the damage you caused, the people you stepped over, the truths you refused to face, not out of malice, just convenience, and it's too late to undo? That's what makes it unbearable. The truth, once uncovered, isn't a new beginning, it's a verdict. It doesn't offer direction, only exposure. You start to question everything. Your relationships, your beliefs, even your own memories. How much did you reshape them without noticing? How much of your life was interpretation, not reality? You look at people differently now, not because they've changed, but because you finally see what was always there. The resentment in their smiles, the distance in their eyes. You remember moments you thought were meaningful. Now they feel rehearsed, scripted. You start asking questions you can't stop. Was I ever really happy? Or was I just distracted? Did they ever really care? Or did they just need something from me? You dig deeper, hoping to find something solid underneath. But it's all soft. It crumbles when touched. Even your values feel shaky. You used to feel sure about what was right, what mattered. But now, every choice seems compromised. Every stance built on convenience, context, self-preservation. You wonder if morality was ever more than a posture, something you wore when it was safe to do so. You try to act normal, you go through the motions, but everything feels staged. Your laughter is too loud, your silence is too long. You start to avoid eye contact, not because you're hiding anything, but because you're afraid of what they might see in you now. And then comes the worst part. The isolation, not from others, but from yourself. You no longer recognize the person you used to be, but you're not sure who you are now, either. You exist in between, detached, observing your own life like a stranger watching through glass. You thought the truth would give you control, but it only took away your ability to pretend, and pretending was what held everything together. Now, nothing fits. Conversations feel scripted. Plans feel absurd. The future feels like a story someone else wrote. You start to envy people who believe easily, who still find comfort in illusion. You watch them with quiet desperation, wanting to feel what they feel. But the truth blocks you. It stands between you and your old life, permanent and immovable. You wonder what it would take to forget, to unknow, to go back. But the truth doesn't let go. It stays with you, in every moment of doubt, in every quiet pause, in every conversation where you smile and say you're fine, because you understand now. The truth doesn't make things clearer, it makes them unbearable, and you'll carry it with you, silently, like a weight that no one else sees. Always wondering, not whether it was right to learn it, but whether anything can ever feel real again. Imagine you've done something wrong, something serious. Maybe it wasn't intentional, maybe it was, but either way you're caught. And now everyone wants justice. They want you to suffer, to feel what your actions made others feel, to understand the pain you caused, not in theory but directly, physically, emotionally. They say it's not revenge, it's fairness. You caused harm, so you should feel harm. At first, this feels right, balanced. Someone does something terrible, and something terrible happens to them in return. It satisfies that primal sense that actions have consequences, that the world isn't just random cruelty, that suffering follows wrongdoing, not just because it should, but because it must. You've believed this too. You've nodded along when others called for harsh punishments. Maybe you've whispered to yourself that certain people deserve to hurt. Maybe you've even felt comfort in imagining that pain being delivered. Maybe it gave you peace. But now the chains are around your own wrists. And the silence of the cell doesn't feel like fairness. It feels like abandonment, like being buried alive in a story where you no longer get to speak. You try to explain what happened. You say you didn't mean to, or that you did mean it. But you've changed, that you were in pain yourself, that it was more complicated than they know. But no one listens. They just say, you should have thought of that before. The logic hasn't changed, only your position in it. When punishment was happening to someone else, it felt like the system worked. Now it feels like the system is a machine with no brakes. It doesn't know who you are. It doesn't care. You start to realize something uncomfortable, that what people call justice is often just suffering dressed up in moral language. That what you thought was balance might have always been cruelty with better branding. You think back to all the times you cheered it on. Times when you heard about someone being sentenced, or humiliated, or ruined. You didn't ask many questions then. You assumed they deserved it. You didn't wonder what they felt. You told yourself they were just getting what they earned. And now you're here. And the same logic that made you feel safe now makes you feel hopeless. You try to hold on to the idea that justice is about more than pain, that it's about repair, growth, maybe even mercy. But those ideas don't carry much weight when the punishment begins. They sound weak, naïve, like excuses. People don't want to hear about your growth when they still feel your damage. They don't want to forgive you when they can't forget what you did. And maybe they're right. But here's where the logic turns back on itself. If pain is what makes things fair, then what happens when the pain never stops? When punishment doesn't lead to understanding, but just to more punishment? What if the suffering just loops endlessly, justified every step of the way? Is there a point where justice becomes just another form of harm? You start to see that punishment doesn't erase what you did. It doesn't undo the past. It doesn't bring anyone back or fix what's broken. It just adds more weight to the pile, more pain to the world. And then a darker question surfaces. What if the people punishing you aren't doing it for justice at all? What if they're doing it because it feels good? Because seeing you suffer makes them feel powerful, righteous, clean. You wonder if that's what you were doing, back when the chains were on someone else. And now you're stuck, caught in a system you once believed in, surrounded by people who see you only as the worst thing you've ever done. You tell yourself that you're more than that people are more than their worst moments. But no one listens, not anymore. The justice you supported now feels like a trap that was always waiting for you. A logic that seems fair from the outside, but feels like drowning from the inside. And the truth that starts to settle in is this. It's easy to believe in punishment when you think it will never touch you. Easy to cheer for consequences when you feel safe from them. Easy to moralize when the pain belongs to someone else. But once you're the one in chains, you begin to see clearly. Not just what punishment does to a person, but what it reveals about everyone who demands it. Because the moment you're in chains, justice no longer feels like justice. It just feels like pain, and it doesn't end. What if you spent years solving a problem that never existed? Not a simple misunderstanding, not a miscommunication or an overreaction, but something deeper, something that was never real to begin with. A threat, a flaw, a danger you believed was there and worked endlessly to fix. But there was nothing ever needed fixing. You wouldn't know at first. The effort would feel noble. You'd feel responsible, maybe even proud. You'd spend your energy untangling it, correcting it, perfecting it. People might even admire your dedication. You'd believe you were protecting something important. Yourself, someone else, the future. You'd feel useful. Anchored, but slowly something starts to feel off. The results don't match the effort. The solutions don't solve anything, because there's nothing there to solve. But by now you're too far in, too much time has passed. You can't walk away, so you keep trying. You convince yourself the problem must be hidden, deeper than expected, more complex than anyone thought. You stop trusting what you see. You stop trusting what others say. Because if the problem isn't real, then what does that mean about you? It means you've been wrong, not just once, but constantly, exhaustively, and not by accident, but by belief. You built yourself around this. Every improvement you made, every step you took, every sacrifice, all of it based on an illusion. The fear you swore was real, the danger you were certain of, the flaw you felt you had to fix. It never existed. What do you do with that? Most people don't accept it. They double down. They invent proof. They reinterpret the past. They drag others in until the illusion becomes collective, shared, validated. Now the problem exists, not in the world, but in the minds of those who believe it. And belief is harder to disprove than reality. You might already know what that feels like. You might remember a time when you were sure something was broken in you. You called it anxiety, trauma, self-sabotage. You looked for evidence everywhere, every failed relationship, every moment of discomfort, every flaw in your reflection. You didn't know what was real anymore, only that something must be wrong. Something had to be. And you tried to fix it. You tried everything. Therapy, habits, control. You studied your own behavior like it was a threat. You mapped your thoughts like they were symptoms. You convinced yourself healing was possible, if you could just find the problem. But what if there wasn't one? What if you were solving a puzzle that had no pieces, fixing a wound that didn't exist? What if your entire structure of self-improvement was built around a misunderstanding of who you are? It's terrifying, Because without the problem, everything unravels. The purpose, the effort, the identity. You don't get the time back. You don't get the certainty. All you're left with is a blank space where meaning used to be. No villain, no answer. Just the quiet ache of realizing you fought something that never fought back. And the worst part is this: if the problem never existed, neither did the solution. All your progress, all your recovery, it becomes a story you told yourself to stay busy, to stay safe, to avoid the silence that might come if you stopped. Now imagine this happening, not just in your mind, but in systems, in institutions. Imagine governments, religions, ideologies built around imaginary threats, entire policies, movements, wars, born from fear of a danger that was never real. And the people inside them, trying to be good, trying to be safe, trying to protect, solving problems that don't exist, creating suffering in the name of prevention. How do you stop that? You don't, because once something is believed, it resists correction, especially when it feels meaningful. When it gives someone a purpose or an identity, they don't want the truth. They want the feeling that comes from trying to fix it. And maybe you're no different. Maybe part of you doesn't want the problem to disappear, because without it, who are you? If you're not broken, not healing, not fighting, then what's left? You start to see the trap, the loop, the illusion feeding itself, solving a problem that never existed and becoming someone who only exists because of that effort. You weren't a victim of something, you were a product of your own fear, and the problem never needed fixing, but you did. Imagine waking up one day and realizing you can't prove you're real, not to anyone else, and not even to yourself. You say, "I think, therefore I am." But who taught you that phrase? Who told you it meant something profound? You trusted someone. A book, a teacher, a voice from the past. But how do you know they weren't wrong? Or lying? Every piece of knowledge you hold, every fact, every logic chain you use to prove your own existence, it all came from outside you. Language, concepts, even the idea of logic itself. You didn't invent these things, they were given to you, and the people who gave them to you, you don't really know them. You don't know what they believed. You don't know what they wanted. Maybe they thought they were helping you. Maybe they didn't care. Maybe they wanted to control you. All you know is that everything you use to define yourself, your beliefs, your categories, your symbols, was handed down by someone else. You want to test your existence logically. You want certainty. But every test requires assumptions. Every proof rests on a foundation. And that foundation is trust. You trust that language means what you think it does. You trust that your senses are accurate. You trust that the people who taught you logic weren't deliberately misleading you. But what if they were, not maliciously? Maybe they were misled too. Maybe every truth you believe is part of a long chain of misunderstandings, passed down like a game of telephone, distorted slightly with every telling. And now, here you are, holding a version of the truth that you never verified, repeating words you never truly understood, convinced they mean something deep. What if the tools you're using to prove your reality are themselves false? What if logic, as you understand it, is just a cultural artifact, something invented, standardized, and enforced? What if it's not truth, but a kind of consensus fiction, a structure of thought agreed upon, not because it's real, but because it's useful? You tell yourself it's different, that logic is pure, that it can't be manipulated. But how would you know? You never made it from scratch. You've only ever used what others built, and the builders, they were flawed, they were biased, they had motives. Sometimes they were cruel, sometimes they were brilliant, sometimes both. And you've accepted their ideas, their categories, their frameworks, without questioning the core. So now you try to start fresh. You want to strip away everything you've been told, go back to basics. Only what you directly perceive, only what you can know for certain. But even then, you're stuck. Because you're using a brain you didn't design, interpreting sensations through filters you didn't choose. You didn't pick your language, you didn't pick your culture, you didn't pick your wiring. And you can't step outside of it. You can't observe yourself objectively. Every thought you have is shaped by something you didn't consent to. Even the sense of I, that persistent feeling of self, might be a construction. A trick your brain plays so it can function. The something evolution shaped to help you survive. Not something that proves you're real. You want to believe you're more than a collection of impulses, that you have a soul, a will, a stable identity. But where is it? Can you point to it? Can you prove it? Or are you just narrating a story that someone else started, using words they gave you, asking questions in a language built by strangers? You don't like that idea. You want something solid. You want to feel like you're standing on bedrock. But the deeper you dig, the more everything crumbles. Because there is no bedrock, only layers of trust. Trust in your senses, trust in your memory, trust in your teachers, your language, your mind. And trust by its nature can't be proven. It can only be given, which means the foundation of yourself, your identity, your certainty, your existence, rests on something unprovable. And what if the people who first taught you to think were wrong, or lying, or just repeating lies they believed? Then what are you? Maybe you're real, maybe you're not, but you can't know. Not with certainty, not without trusting something first. Something that might be false. And maybe the most terrifying part isn't that you could be wrong. It's that you have no choice. You have to trust someone, even if they were a liar, even if everything they gave you was fake. Because without that trust, you can't even begin to prove you exist. Some illusions work better after you spot them. At first, that sounds impossible. The whole point of an illusion is to deceive, to trick you into believing something false. So how could it possibly become more effective after you've seen through it? But consider this. You walk into a room with a mirror on the wall. For a moment you mistake the reflection for another person. Then you realize it's just you. The illusion breaks. Yet somehow the room feels stranger afterward. You're more aware of yourself, of your movements, of being watched by your own image. The illusion stopped tricking you, but it started doing something else, something deeper. Illusions don't always vanish when exposed. Sometimes they shift. They become more sophisticated, more subtle. They start operating on a different level, no longer hiding, but playing with your awareness. Think about optical illusions you've seen a dozen times, the kind where you know the lines are the same length, even though they don't look like it. The illusion still works, not despite your knowledge, but because of it. Your brain doesn't stop seeing the distortion. It just learns to live inside the contradiction. That's when it gets unsettling, because now the illusion isn't fooling you by accident. It's coexisting with your understanding. The falsehood and the truth sit side by side, and you become the space where both exist at once. You can't dismiss it. You can't resolve it. All you can do is hold both ideas in your mind. This isn't real, and it still looks real. That's where discomfort starts to grow. When you know what you're looking at is wrong, but you keep seeing it that way anyway. This doesn't only happen with images. It happens in relationships, in beliefs, in memories. You realize someone you loved wasn't who you thought, but your emotions don't change instantly. You still miss them, still remember them, the way they never really were. The illusion has been spotted, but it keeps working. Not because it's strong, because you are vulnerable to it, even while being aware. And maybe this is where the illusion becomes stronger, because now it doesn't have to hide. Now it operates with your consent. You let it linger. You tell yourself it's harmless. You tell yourself you're too tired to untangle everything. The illusion becomes a choice you make quietly, every day. You know your job is meaningless, but you keep doing it. You know the product you buy doesn't make you happy, but you keep buying it. You know the story you tell about your past is incomplete, maybe even false, but you keep telling it. You keep living it. This isn't failure, it's functionality. You've integrated the illusion, made it part of your world. It no longer has to convince you, it just needs to remain useful. But sometimes the illusion you've spotted becomes something else. Not just a tolerated falsehood, but a framework you depend on. Like an optical trick you rely on to navigate a distorted space. Like a memory you cling to, even knowing it's altered. There's a kind of safety in illusions, even broken ones. A sense of orientation, predictability. They offer structure when truth is too chaotic. Even when you see through them, they can feel more stable than whatever's underneath. That's what makes them dangerous. Because once you've spotted the illusion and decided to keep living inside it, it becomes harder to leave. You start defending it, rationalizing it. Not because you believe it's true, but because you've built too much around it. And then you start to forget where the illusion ends and where you begin. You no longer know if you believe something because it's true or because it's familiar. You don't know if the way you remember someone is accurate or just convenient. You don't know if your grief is real or rehearsed. You stop asking. You stop looking. Because the illusion has stopped trying to fool you. It has started helping you survive. So you cooperate with it. You convince yourself the world is fair, even when you know it's not. You tell yourself you're a good person, even as you lie, avoid, withdraw. You pretend you're okay, because it's easier than admitting you're not. And then one day, you forget that the illusion was ever an illusion. You stop seeing the distortion. You stop noticing the seams. You believe again, not fully, not naively, but enough to stop resisting. And maybe that's the final trick. Not that illusions fool you, but that they become comfortable enough to stop needing to. They don't break when you spot them. They evolve. They wait for you to return. And eventually, you do, willingly. Because sometimes, the hardest illusions to escape are the ones you've already seen through. Would you like to be manipulated, or would you prefer to make the choice yourself? You're told that free will matters, that autonomy is sacred, that what separates control from coercion is the presence of a choice. But what if that's the trap? What if choice isn't the opposite of control, but the method? Imagine someone wants to make you do something, not with threats, not with lies, just with options. They don't command you. They offer two paths. One looks painful, the other just slightly uncomfortable. You choose the second. You feel relief. You think you escaped the worst outcome, but you've still done what they wanted, and you believe it was your idea. This is how control works when it's most effective. It doesn't scream, it whispers. It doesn't push, it nudges. The illusion of freedom is preserved even as your behavior is shaped, because the trick isn't in forcing your hand, it's in choosing which hands you're allowed to play. Now imagine a deeper version. You're offered 3 jobs. One pays poorly, one is dangerous. The third offers stability, decent pay, a chance to move up. You take the third, but you don't ask who designed the options. You don't notice that all 3 jobs funnel you into the same system, that all 3 paths were laid by the same hand, that the sense of agency you feel was built inside boundaries you didn't create. You don't resist. Why would you? You had a choice. But think carefully. How often has choice actually meant freedom in your life? How often has it simply meant choosing the form of your confinement, the brand of your identity, the flavor of your obedience? The most powerful forms of manipulation don't look like force. They look like empowerment. A curated menu of options, each appearing independent, none revealing the framework that limits them. You're given the wheel, but not the map. You steer, but only along the roads they've paved. And if you ever start to feel trapped, they add more options. Another color, another feature, another role, and again, you choose. And again, you feel free. This is how systems sustain themselves. Not by eliminating freedom, but by redesigning it, by giving you just enough autonomy to feel ownership, but not enough to notice the architecture underneath. Consider the rules you live by, the values you hold, the preferences you claim as yours. Trace them back. Where did they begin? Did you choose them, truly, or did you choose from among what was already offered, already permitted, already approved? Choice is comforting because it feels like agency, but comfort itself is a form of control. You're less likely to rebel when you're comfortable. You're less likely to question when you're distracted. And so the illusion persists, not because it's imposed, but because it's accepted. This is the core of the trap. If you feel like you're choosing, you don't realize you're being led. And now think about the moments when you've resisted, when you've rejected all options, when you've asked why these are the only paths available. Those moments felt disorienting, didn't they? They felt lonely, difficult, unnatural, because the system isn't built to handle that kind of refusal. It doesn't need to punish rebellion. It just needs to make non-compliance feel impossible. You look around and everyone else is choosing, smiling, participating. You begin to wonder if maybe the problem is you. Maybe you're the one overthinking. Maybe you should just pick something and move on. That's the real mechanism of control, not enforcement, isolation. Eventually, most people stop asking. They pick a path, any path, and they rationalize it. They tell themselves it's what they wanted all along. And once the decision is made, the mind begins to forget the original discomfort. It folds the choice into the story of the self. It calls the compromise growth. But some part of you remembers, a quiet part. A part that noticed how none of the options ever felt right. A part that wondered what it would mean to step off the path entirely. Not just to reject a choice, but to reject the structure of choice itself. And that's where the fear begins. Because to reject the structure is to stand alone. It means confronting the possibility that much of your life has been shaped not by who you are, but by what you were offered. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. You can't look at your decisions the same way again. You start to ask deeper questions about your job, your relationships, your values, your identity. You start to see how many of them were formed in response to incentives you didn't create. And that's when you realize the full weight of the problem. It's not that choice is fake, it's that it's limited, engineered, framed. And within that frame, your sense of agency becomes a tool, not for freedom, but for control. Because the easiest way to control a mind is to offer a choice. Would you still believe it's wrong if it feels completely right? When fear begins to speak, logic doesn't vanish, it just rearranges itself. The same mind that once held a firm moral stance begins to shift, not with violence, but with quiet reasoning. You don't scream or collapse. You justify, you explain. You make it make sense. At first, the idea is unthinkable. You wouldn't do something cruel. You wouldn't become someone you once condemned. But then a threat appears, a sudden danger, a loss that feels too close, and you feel something new, the need to act, to protect, to survive. In that moment, logic starts to work differently. You find connections that weren't there before. Reasons that didn't seem valid yesterday become undeniable now. You see consequences, patterns, threats, every possibility turning into a justification. Not because the action is good, but because the alternative feels unbearable. Fear sharpens the imagination. It makes you anticipate horrors that haven't happened yet, but could. You see them vividly, and the more vivid they become, the more justified your reaction seems. You're not lashing out. You're preventing something worse. You're not being cruel. You're making the hard choice no one else will. That's the trick, isn't it? Evil doesn't always come dressed in rage or hatred. Sometimes it wears the calm face of reason. A voice that says, "This is necessary." And once you believe it's necessary, the guilt fades. The hesitation disappears. You begin to feel proud, resolute, righteous. You're still yourself. You haven't changed your core values. You've just reinterpreted them, rewritten them in a way that fits this new fear. You still believe in compassion, in justice. But now compassion looks like punishment. Justice looks like preemption. And the more fear you feel, the clearer it becomes. The dangerous ones are them. The threats are out there, and anything you do to stop them starts to feel logical. Even when it's cruel, even when it's irreversible. You might tell yourself this is temporary, just until things are safe again. But safety never feels complete. There's always one more threat, one more reason to tighten your grip, to go a little further. And with each step, the line between good and evil fades. Not in a dramatic collapse, but in small, invisible shifts. Tiny changes in how you see the world, and in how you justify what you do. You still tell yourself you're on the right side. Maybe now more than ever. You point to the fear, the danger, the risk, and say, "This is why." You look back at those who refuse to act and wonder how they can be so naive, so blind to what's coming. But deep down, you know, they're not blind. They just haven't let fear rewrite their logic yet. They still see the cruelty for what it is, and that frightens you more than anything. Because if they're right, then what does that make you? You don't want to think about that, so you double down. You find new justifications, new arguments. You surround yourself with people who agree, who reinforce the same chain of logic, and it stops feeling like fear. It starts feeling like clarity, but clarity built on fear isn't stable. It requires constant reinforcement, constant vigilance, and anything that challenges it feels like a threat, not to your ideas, but to your identity. Because if your logic collapses, so does the version of yourself you've built, so you fight to preserve it. You push harder, speak louder, take more drastic steps, not because you're confident, but because you're terrified that the entire structure might fall if you let doubt in. And the more extreme your actions become, the more you have to believe they were necessary. Otherwise, the guilt would destroy you. That's how it happens. Not in a moment of rage, but in a series of decisions that each feel justified, each driven by fear, each dressed in logic. Until one day, you look back and see how far you've gone. And there's no clear line where right became wrong, just a quiet slide into something you once swore you'd never become. But even now, you resist that conclusion. You insist there's still a difference, that your reasons are better, that your fear is real. And maybe it is. But what matters isn't whether the fear was real. It's whether it took control, whether it used your logic to guide your hand towards something you can never undo. You think fear makes you cautious, but more often, it makes you certain. And certainty, in the wrong moment, is how evil begins to feel like the only rational choice. And by the time you realize it wasn't, it's already too late to go back. Why do people who understand the rules still fall for the game? You might think that knowing how manipulation works would make you immune to it, that understanding the tactics, the incentives, the framing, the traps would act as a shield, but in reality, it often makes you more vulnerable, not less. Because once you believe you're above manipulation, you stop looking for it. You assume your awareness protects you, that you'll recognize the moment someone tries to exploit your thinking. You stop questioning your responses. You stop noticing the subtle pressure. And slowly, without realizing, your awareness becomes your weakness. You see the trick, and instead of avoiding it, you step into it, just to prove you're smarter than it. You think, I know what they're doing, so it can't work on me. But that thought is the opening. That confidence is the invitation. A skilled manipulator doesn't need you to be ignorant. They need you to be proud. They'll let you feel clever. Let you believe you've seen through the illusion. Because if you feel like you're in control, you stop resisting. And if you stop resisting, they don't have to push. They just wait. Imagine someone frames a choice for you. Two options. One seems obviously worse, too extreme, too costly. The other feels reasonable, balanced, safe. You choose it. You feel good about it. But you don't notice that both options were designed to serve the same outcome. You picked the second one because you thought it was your idea. Knowing about this trick doesn't protect you. It just shifts the form it takes. The game changes shape once you think you've solved it. The manipulator doesn't need to hide their motives anymore. They can show you the structure, the logic, the architecture of persuasion, and still lead you exactly where they want. Because now you're not guarding your emotions, you're guarding your intellect, and that's easier to bypass. People often think manipulation is about lies. It's not. It's about attention. It's about narrowing the frame, steering your focus, changing what you believe is relevant. It's about showing you two paths while hiding the third. And if you know the rules too well, you'll focus only on what you've been taught to watch for. You'll search for the obvious traps, the emotional appeals, the logical fallacies. But you won't look for the silence, the things that weren't said, the options that weren't offered. Manipulation works best when you think you're doing everything voluntarily. When the frame aligns with your self-image, when the outcome flatters your identity, you won't question it. You'll call it a logical decision. You'll call it being strategic, informed, in control. But the truth is, the more you believe in your immunity, the easier you are to guide. You can know every bias, every fallacy, every trick in the book. But knowledge doesn't make you neutral. It just changes what you're blind to. Think about all the times you've anticipated a lie and missed the half-truth instead. All the times you resisted an appeal to emotion and embraced a false sense of reason. All the times you thought, I'm too aware to fall for this, and didn't notice the new form it took. Being aware of manipulation doesn't make you harder to deceive. It makes you easier to calibrate. It tells the manipulator what not to use. It gives them a blueprint of your defenses. And if they know what you expect, they know exactly how to work around it. Just like a magician learns your habits of attention, what you'll look at, what you'll ignore, a manipulator learns your habits of resistance. And they use them. They use your critical thinking as a cue, your skepticism as a compass. Your pride in being rational becomes the tool they exploit. Because they know you won't see yourself as manipulated if the process looks like a logical conclusion you came to on your own. They won't argue with you. They'll let you argue with yourself. They won't push you. They'll wait until you choose, freely, the thing they wanted all along. Because when you do that, you'll defend the decision. You'll feel ownership over it, and you'll keep going. The deeper problem is this: once you believe that knowledge makes you safe, you stop protecting yourself emotionally. You expose your confidence, your identity, your sense of self as a smart person, and that becomes the target. It's not your beliefs that get exploited, it's your attachment to the idea that you formed them rationally. And that's why the rules aren't a defense. They're a map, a guidebook, not for you, but for the person who wants to reach you. Every rule you know becomes a pathway, every pattern a handle, every assumption a doorway. The clearer your thinking seems to you, the more predictable you become to them. You don't see it happening because it feels like autonomy, like clarity, like choice. But slowly, invisibly, your decisions get shaped, not by force, not by lies, but by the structure of the frame itself. And by the time you realize it, you're too far in. You don't know what you truly wanted or what was placed in front of you. You don't know if the decision was yours or if it was built around you. You don't know if you're thinking critically or just following a pattern someone else anticipated. Because you can know the rules. You can study every tactic. You can name every bias and still fall again and again. Not in spite of what you know, but because of it. If nothing matters, why does suffering still hurt? That question doesn't wait politely. It cuts in line, steps right into the center of your thoughts, and refuses to leave. You tell yourself you've accepted meaninglessness. You've looked the universe in the face and seen nothing staring back. No grand design, no final justice, no hidden purpose, just atoms, motion, chance. And yet, when pain arrives, all that detachment disappears. You burn your hand and it burns. You lose someone and it hurts. No amount of cosmic indifference seems to dull the immediate, intimate weight of suffering, and that contradiction lingers. If the universe is cold, then why does pain feel so personal? You try to reason through it. Pain is evolutionary, a biological mechanism, nothing more than signals sent from nerves to brain, chemicals and circuits designed to protect you from harm, to keep your body intact. But knowing that doesn't help. It still hurts. The explanation doesn't soften the sensation. It only distances you from it. You tell yourself that life has no inherent value. That meaning is a human invention, stitched together to ease our fear of randomness. But even if that's true, you still flinch when you're cut. You still mourn what you lose. You still lie awake, replaying regrets that should by your logic mean nothing. So then what? Is suffering just another illusion, like purpose? A trick of the mind, useful, maybe, but ultimately hollow. If so, why is it so convincing? Why can't you simply reject it the way you've rejected belief, hope, or permanence? You might think that understanding the mechanics of suffering would rob it of its sting. That awareness should bring detachment. But suffering doesn't care what you believe. It doesn't need your permission to exist. You can deny everything else, but pain forces itself through. You feel it before you think. It bypasses philosophy completely. Even worse, suffering makes no demands. It doesn't ask for meaning. It just is. It arrives uninvited, sits with you in silence, and refuses to explain itself. And because you can't make it meaningful, it becomes unbearable in a different way. You suffer, and then you suffer more, because the suffering itself seems pointless. Maybe that's the deepest contradiction. Not that suffering exists in a meaningless world, but that in a meaningless world, suffering continues to feel like it should mean something, that it should signal injustice, or loss, or something sacred being violated. But there's no sacredness here, just matter, just decay. Still, pain insists. It insists you take notice. It insists that something matters, if only this. If only the hurt. You start to wonder if suffering is the last thing you believe in. not because you choose to, but because you have no choice. You can stop believing in love, in truth, in the soul, but not in pain. Pain is undeniable. It becomes your reality when all else feels uncertain. It speaks a language that reason can't silence. And then a darker thought. Maybe suffering hurts, not despite the emptiness of life, but because of it. Maybe in a world without meaning, pain becomes the only thing you can't ignore. The only thing that cuts through the fog, not a signal of damage, but a signal of your own helplessness. Your inability to hide from what's real. And if that's true, then maybe pain isn't an error or a glitch. Maybe it's the only honest part of you. Everything else is theory. Pain is proof that you're alive, that you're vulnerable, that no matter how much you reject meaning, your body still believes in consequence. So what do you do with that? Do you lean into it, let it define you? Or do you try to erase it, to numb it, distract from it, bury it beneath distraction or denial? But even if you succeed, suffering waits. It always waits, in illness, in aging, in loss, in silence. And here's what's most disturbing. Even if the universe truly is meaningless, suffering still matters to you. It hijacks your thoughts, rewrites your priorities, controls your actions. You may tell yourself that nothing matters, but suffering doesn't listen. It acts like it's the only thing that ever has. And perhaps it is. Because if meaning is a lie, and pleasure is temporary, and truth is uncertain, then pain might be the only thing left that feels real. Not because it deserves to be, not because it reveals anything, but simply because it endures, because it leaves a mark, because you remember it when everything else fades. So maybe that's the final trap. You try to escape meaning, to free yourself from the burden of belief. But pain drags you back, not into faith, not into hope, but into experience, immediate, raw, unfiltered. You don't get to choose whether it matters. It hurts, and that's all it takes. And now you realize the question was never philosophical. It was personal, always personal. If nothing matters, why does suffering still hurt? Because pain doesn't care what you believe. What if the same piece of evidence proves both guilt and innocence? Not because it's ambiguous, not because it's unclear, but because the very nature of evidence, what it means, how it's interpreted, is shaped entirely by what you already believe. You might think evidence leads to truth, that it's a guiding light, something objective and steady. But evidence doesn't stand on its own. It's not self-explanatory. It only means something once you've already decided what you're looking for. A footprint at the scene of a crime. If you think someone is guilty, it's proof they were there. If you think they're innocent, it's proof someone's framing them. The same mark on the floor confirms opposite truths depending on the story you've already accepted. And this isn't rare, it's the default. You think you're reasoning from facts to conclusions. But most of the time, you're doing the opposite. You start with the conclusion, and then find ways to make the facts fit. Not consciously, not read with malice, just quietly, automatically, because it feels more natural to protect what you already believe than to let it collapse. The stronger your belief, the more easily the evidence becomes fuel for it. Contradictory information doesn't change your mind, it deepens your certainty. The more someone argues against you, the more you feel validated. You tell yourself the resistance is proof you're right. You read hostility as desperation, silence as concession, complexity as deception. This is how people come to believe completely opposite things with the same set of facts. How one person sees a tragedy and finds injustice, while another sees the same moment and finds justification. how a protest can look like bravery or violence, depending on which truth you've already chosen. Even your memories aren't immune. You think they're fixed, but they change each time you revisit them, not just in detail, but in meaning. A kind gesture from someone you now distrust becomes manipulation. A painful moment from someone you love becomes a misunderstanding. The facts don't change, but their story does, because you do. You might believe you're being logical, that you're following reason. But logic isn't a neutral path. It's shaped by the assumptions you start with. It's a tool, not a compass. You can use it to justify almost anything if you begin in the right place. If you frame the question carefully enough, almost any answer can seem inevitable. And this is where it gets darker. Because once you realize that evidence bends this easily, you start to see how fragile truth really is. Not because the facts aren't real, but because their meaning never exists on its own. It always requires interpretation. And interpretation is never free from bias, emotion, or fear. Now imagine being in a courtroom. You hear the same evidence presented to two sides. Same fingerprints, same timeline, same testimonies. One side sees guilt, the other, innocence. Both are utterly convinced. Both are certain they have the truth. The jury listens. They're told to be impartial. But they aren't blank slates. Each juror arrives with a lifetime of unconscious filters, preferences, suspicions. They don't just hear evidence, they hear it through themselves. This doesn't just happen in courts, it happens everywhere. In politics, relationships, science, history. Two people see the same chart, the same news story, the same study, and walk away with opposite conclusions. And each one thinks the other is blind, irrational, corrupted by agenda. But it's not corruption, it's construction. Each person has built a mental world that makes their interpretation feel inevitable. You can't escape it. Even knowing it's happening doesn't free you from it. In fact, knowing about bias can sometimes make you more confident that you're objective. It gives you the illusion of distance. But awareness doesn't erase distortion. It just hides it deeper. So what do you trust when the same evidence proves both sides? When logic doesn't lead to truth, but to reinforcement? When even your own memory shifts, depending on how you feel, there's no simple answer. That's the trap. You think you can escape by being more rational, more careful. But the trap isn't in your process. It's in your starting point. And most of the time, you don't get to choose that. It's already been chosen for you by your experiences, your fears, your desires. Maybe the most unsettling part isn't that truth is hard to find. It's that you might never even notice when you've stopped looking for it. Because once the evidence fits, you stop asking questions, and in that moment, the story you believe becomes the only one you can see. You were never given a real choice. You only think you chose it. That's the trap. From the moment you were old enough to speak, you were surrounded by people who needed you to believe certain things. Parents, teachers, friends. They told you stories about effort, about responsibility, about doing the right thing. They praised independence, rewarded obedience, and called it freedom. But ask yourself quietly, honestly, where did the idea of free will come from? Not the words, not the definition, the feeling, the instinct that your choices are yours alone. That feeling didn't arise in a vacuum. It was installed like a suggestion, whispered early and often, until it began to feel like your own voice. You didn't choose your language, your culture, your fears, your desires. You didn't choose your genetics, your environment, your childhood experiences, and yet you believe you chose your beliefs, your values, your path. Because someone told you that you did. You were told that freedom means making choices. But they never told you how many of your choices were already shaped before you even made them. How the options in front of you were never neutral. How the rules were already written. How the game was always tilted in favor of certain outcomes. And when you question that, when you try to trace a choice back to its origin, it disappears. You can't find the start. You can't isolate the moment it became yours. Every decision seems to rest on 1,000 prior causes, each one outside your control, a preference shaped by experience, experience shaped by accident, accident shaped by forces too complex to understand. But still, you insist you are free, because you feel free, because the alternative is unbearable. If you aren't the author of your actions, then what are you? A puppet, a pattern, a consequence. It's not that you don't want to see the truth. It's that your entire identity depends on not seeing it. You've been trained, subtly, continuously, to take ownership of your decisions. To feel pride in success, guilt in failure, responsibility in harm. Not because it's true, but because it keeps society functioning, keeps people motivated, keeps order. And maybe that's the real reason free will feels sacred, because if no one chooses, then no one deserves. No one earns their place, no one deserves their punishment, no one deserves their praise. Everything becomes luck, chaos, and that breaks something inside you. So you cling to the illusion. You tell yourself you are in control, that your past doesn't define you, that your impulses can be overcome, that you can be better. Because if you didn't choose this, if you didn't shape who you are, then what's left to improve? But here's the deeper trap. Even your resistance to this idea was predicted. The instinct to defend free will is not a proof of it. It's just another response, automatic, conditioned, inevitable. You recoil because that's what people do when their self-image is threatened. That too is part of the script. And yet, even now, a part of you whispers, "No, not me. I know I'm different." But where did that whisper come from? Did you summon it freely? Or is it just another voice in the system, trained to preserve the illusion? The most disturbing part isn't that you lack free will. It's that you never had the chance to question it without already being biased toward defending it. You were told to believe, and so you do. And the more deeply you believe, the more real it feels. But feelings don't create truth. You think of yourself as an agent, a chooser, a conscious force in the world. But every thought, every impulse, every moral conviction arises from somewhere. And if you didn't choose that source, then what, exactly, did you choose? Even now, you're trying to decide what you think about this, whether to accept it, reject it, debate it. But that process, the struggle to decide, is part of it too. It feels like freedom, but it's not. It's just the gears turning, as they were always going to turn, because you were taught to believe in free will, and you never stopped to ask what that belief cost you. You didn't choose the story, you only inherited it. And now you keep telling it to yourself, again and again, trying to make it true. Would you even notice if the world around you started to blur? Not suddenly, not dramatically, just a little softer, a little less defined, like the edges of everything, truth, memory, identity, begin to fade, bending quietly around the stories you need to tell yourself. You might think you care about truth, about facts, about reality. But the more you look closely, the more you see that your life isn't shaped by what's real. It's shaped by what you believe is real. And belief is never neutral. It's sculpted, one detail at a time, into something useful, something survivable. You remember a childhood where your parents always tried their best. You remember being loved, even if the evidence says otherwise. Even if there were long nights of silence, or shouting, or fear, the story becomes they did their best. Because the alternative is too painful. Because survival depends on believing it. You remember the relationship ending for good reasons, irreconcilable differences. You were both at fault. It wasn't abuse, it wasn't neglect. It was mutual. You say this not because it's true, but because you need it to be. You need the kind version to keep going. So the story bends, and you don't even notice it. Memory isn't a record, it's a negotiation. Each time you recall something, you reshape it slightly. You soften some edges, blur others, add a small explanation here, remove a contradiction there. Not to lie, not to deceive, but to survive. You begin to realize that even your sense of self is a story, a stitched-together narrative, carefully edited over time. You emphasize your strengths, minimize your flaws. You highlight the moments when you were generous, thoughtful, wise. You bury the ones where you were cruel, selfish, weak. You don't erase them, you just quietly make them smaller. And every time you tell the story of yourself, you reinforce it. Even if it's not real, not entirely. It becomes real enough to believe, real enough to live inside. But here's the problem. Reality doesn't care about what you need. It keeps happening, indifferent to your stories. People remember things differently than you. Evidence contradicts your version, new information emerges, and it doesn't fit. And now you face a choice. You could adjust the story, accept the discomfort. Acknowledge the parts that don't flatter you. Let the pain in. But most people don't. Most people double down. They discard the inconvenient detail. They reject the challenge. Because keeping the story alive feels safer than updating it. So reality bends a little more. You start telling yourself you were justified. You had no choice. You did what anyone would have done. The story tightens, grows more certain, and in that certainty, the real world becomes harder to see. Now you believe your version fully. Even when someone else looks at the same moment and sees something entirely different, you don't feel like you're lying. You feel like you're defending the truth. But it's not truth anymore. It's insulation. And then you start to notice it elsewhere. In politics, in history, in relationships. People clinging to stories that don't hold up, convincing themselves of patterns, motives, villains, heroes. Not because it's real, but because it gives them meaning, gives them control, gives them someone to blame. And maybe that's the most dangerous part. Because when enough people need a story badly enough, reality starts to reshape around it. Not physically, psychologically, socially. A version of the world begins to emerge, not because it's true, but because it's useful, because it helps people function, helps them feel safe, helps them explain their pain. And over time, the line between what happened and what was needed blurs entirely. You find yourself doubting your own memories. Did it really happen that way? Were you really that innocent, that blameless? You start to realize you don't remember what's real. You remember what helped you sleep, what helped you stay sane. And the more you think about it, the more it unsettles you. Because if every story is bent slightly to serve a need, how do you ever find the truth? What if there is no unbent version left? What if all that remains are stories polished smooth by repetition, softened by trauma, twisted gently into survival tools? And then you have to ask, if these stories help you live, are they wrong? If they protect you, stabilize you, keep you moving, what does it matter if they're not exactly real? Maybe everyone needs a slightly false version of themselves to hold together. Maybe reality as it actually is would be too unbearable to look at directly. So we live inside these narratives, not because we're liars, but because we're fragile, because without the right story, the world becomes too sharp, too cold, too unlivable. And that's the trap, because the more you rely on those stories, the less able you are to see when they stop serving you. The less willing you are to challenge them, even when they're hurting you, even when they're keeping you stuck, even when they're the very thing you need to let go of. But by then, you can't tell the difference between the story and yourself, and so you keep telling it, even when no one's listening, even when you know it's not true, even when it's the reason you can't change. What if the only reason you pressed the button was because you were told not to? No prize, no punishment, no reason at all, just a button and a warning, don't touch it. But you're alone. No one's watching. The room is silent, and the button is still there. You tell yourself it doesn't matter, that you're just curious, that it's probably nothing. But something in you knows better. You feel the tension, the unspoken threat, the implied consequence that doesn't need to be explained. And still, your finger twitches. Because you want to know. You want to know what it does. You want to know why you were told not to. You want to know if anything would actually happen, or if it's all just a lie. You don't need a reason. You don't even need the outcome to be good. What you need is resolution, certainty, the end of not knowing. So you stand there, telling yourself it's harmless, telling yourself that if there were real consequences, someone would have stopped you by now, that it's just a test, a trick, a meaningless device with no real power. But what if it's not? What if the button erases someone you love? What if it changes you in a way you can never reverse? What if it does nothing at all, except prove something terrifying about who you are? You want to think you're in control, that your curiosity is innocent, that your logic is sound. But maybe it's not logic driving you. Maybe it's the need to defy, to violate a rule, just to feel something, to prove you're free. And yet, freedom isn't what it feels like. Not really. What you're chasing isn't autonomy, it's rupture. You want to break the rules, not escape them. You want to see the consequence, not avoid it. So the button becomes something else. A mirror, a test, a quiet dare whispered by your own mind. Would you still press it if you knew someone else would suffer? Would you still press it if nothing happened at all? Because maybe what you're really after isn't knowledge or change or excitement. Maybe you just want to know that the world will respond, that something out there still reacts when you move, that your actions still matter, even if what you cause is destruction, even if what you learn is horrifying, even if what you prove is that some part of you wanted to hurt something, just to feel the difference between before and after. And then it gets worse. You start to wonder how many times you've already pressed buttons like this, without knowing. Small actions, casual words, thoughtless decisions that unleashed consequences you never saw. You start to see every choice as a button, every impulse, every temptation, every moment where you moved forward just to see what would happen next. And you start to realize you don't always care what the outcome is. You care that there is one, that the world reacts, that your boredom is broken. Which means the most disturbing part isn't the button itself. It's what your urge to press it reveals, not just about your curiosity, not just about your willingness to risk, but about your need to feel something shift. And maybe that need is deeper than you thought. Maybe it's not curiosity that drives you. It's something quieter, something more dangerous, a hunger for rupture, a craving for consequence, even if you regret it the moment after. Even if the only thing the button does is remind you what you're capable of choosing, especially then.